There are moments when the silence becomes unbearable, when the voices of doubt grow louder than any prayer, when the strongest among us discover that faith, no matter how fierce, cannot shield us from our own humanity. This is the story of a man who called down fire from heaven, yet found himself broken beneath a desert tree, begging for an end. This is the story of Elijah, not at his most powerful, but at his most human. And this is the story of a God who speaks not always in thunder, but sometimes in a whisper so gentle it can only be heard by the utterly broken. When faith grows weary. The ancient world knew exhaustion. It knew the weight of standing alone against empires, the burden of witnessing truth rejected, the agony of fighting battles that seemed to bring no lasting change. But perhaps no one in the sacred texts understood this weariness quite like Elijah the Tishbite, a prophet whose name meant "My God is Yahweh," a declaration of identity that would become both his greatest strength and his heaviest burden. We often speak of faith as if it were armour, impenetrable and constant. We imagine biblical heroes as superhuman, their trust in God unshakable, their courage limitless. But the scriptures tell a different story. They tell us of men and women who believed deeply, yet struggled profoundly, who performed miracles yet battled despair, who heard the voice of God yet felt utterly alone. Elijah's story is not one of constant victory. It is a story of peaks and valleys, of triumph followed by terror, of divine power interrupted by very human fear. It is a story that echoes through millennia because it speaks to a truth we all recognise. Even the most faithful can feel empty, afraid, and abandoned. But most importantly, it is a story about how God meets us in our weakness, not always with spectacle, not always with obvious intervention, sometimes with something far more precious, the quiet, steady assurance of his presence when everything else has fallen away. Chapter 1. Elijah at the height of power. The northern kingdom of Israel had fallen into darkness. Not the darkness of night, but something far more sinister, the darkness of spiritual betrayal. King Ahab sat on the throne, a ruler whose weakness of character was matched only by the malevolence of his wife, Queen Jezebel. Together they had led an entire nation away from the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and toward the worship of Baal, the Canaanite deity of storms and fertility. The transformation had been gradual but thorough. What began as political compromise, marrying a foreign princess to secure alliances, had metastasized into wholesale apostasy. Jezebel had not simply brought her gods with her from Phoenicia. She had systematically worked to replace the worship of Yahweh with the worship of Baal throughout the kingdom. Temples to Baal dotted the landscape, their architecture foreign and imposing, their rituals designed to appeal to the basest, human desires and fears. Hundreds of prophets served at tables laden with royal provisions, spreading their false doctrines across the land. These were not humble seekers of truth, but well-fed beneficiaries of royal patronage, men who had discovered that telling people what they wanted to hear was far more profitable than proclaiming what they needed to know. The altars of the Lord lay in ruins. The priests of Yahweh had been driven into hiding or killed outright. The sacred sites where generations had worshipped were now overgrown with weeds or repurposed for idolatrous ceremonies. The true prophets were hunted like criminals, forced to hide in caves and cisterns, dependent on the few remaining faithful for food and shelter. The faithful themselves were scattered and afraid. To openly worship Yahweh was to invite persecution, to risk property, position, even life itself. Many had compromised, attending the festivals of Baal, while perhaps maintaining private devotion to the God of their fathers. Others had simply drifted away, finding it easier to follow the crowd than to stand against the tide. Still others had genuinely converted, convinced by years of propaganda that Baal was responsible for the rain and harvest, that the old ways were obsolete, that the future belonged to those who embraced the new order. It seemed as though the covenant itself had been forgotten, as though the very identity of God's chosen people had been erased. The stories of Abraham, Moses and Joshua were becoming mere folklore, quaint tales of a bygone era with no relevance to modern life. The nation that had been called to be a light to the Gentiles had instead adopted the Gentiles' darkness as their own. Into this apostasy stepped a figure from the wilderness of Gilead. Elijah arrived in the royal court like a sudden storm, his appearance as rough as the message he carried. His clothing was woven from hair, his face weathered by sun and wind, his eyes burning with prophetic fire. With no preamble, no diplomatic courtesy, no concern for protocol or consequence, he delivered a proclamation that would alter the course of history. There would be neither dew nor rain in Israel except by his word. The audacity of the statement was breathtaking. Here was a nobody from nowhere, confronting the most powerful man in the kingdom, pronouncing judgment not just on the king but on the entire land. But more than audacity, it was a direct challenge to Baal himself. The Canaanite deity was supposed to control the weather, to send the rains that made crops grow and livestock thrive. If Yahweh could shut up the heavens at the word of his prophet, what did that say about Baal's supposed power? For 3 long years the land suffered under an unprecedented drought. The heavens became bronze, unyielding and merciless. The earth turned to dust beneath the relentless sun. What began as concern grew into alarm, then into desperation, then into catastrophe. Crops failed year after year. Livestock died for lack of water and fodder. Springs and wells dried up. Famine stalked the land like a spectre, claiming the weak, the young, the old. The people cried out to Baal. They performed the prescribed rituals, offered the required sacrifices, participated in the sacred processions. The prophets of Baal assured them that their God would answer, that the drought was merely a test, that faithfulness would be rewarded. But the skies remained mercilessly clear, day after day, week after week, month after month. In the 3rd year of drought, with the nation on the brink of complete collapse, Elijah emerged once more from hiding. He went to King Ahab with a proposition so audacious it bordered on madness. On Mount Carmel, before the assembled people of Israel, there would be a contest. The prophets of Baal, 450 of them, would call on their God. Elijah alone would call on Yahweh. Whichever deity answered with fire to consume a sacrifice would be proven the true God. Ahab, desperate for any solution to the crisis destroying his kingdom, agreed. Word went out across Israel. The people gathered on Mount Carmel, drawn by curiosity, desperation, or perhaps some faint hope that ancient questions might finally be answered. The scene that unfolded on that mountain became the stuff of legend. 2 altars were prepared, 2 bulls slaughtered and laid on wood. The prophets of Baal, confident in their numbers and their god's supposed power, went first. They began their rituals at morning light, calling on Baal with increasing fervour as the hours passed. "Baal, answer us," they cried, dancing around their altar in prescribed patterns, their voices rising in rehearsed incantations. The morning wore on. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the mountain. Still no response. The prophets redoubled their efforts, their voices growing hoarse, their movements more frantic. By midday it had become a spectacle of desperation. The prophets were leaping on the altar, shouting until their throats bled with the effort. Some had begun cutting themselves with swords and spears, blood streaming down their bodies in ritualistic frenzy, believing that perhaps the sight of their suffering would move their God to action. Elijah watched with a mixture of profound sorrow and righteous irony. At noon he called out to them, his voice cutting through their chaotic cries. "Shout louder," he suggested with devastating mockery. "Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or travelling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." The mockery stung, but it was also a profound theological statement. A God who sleeps, who can be too busy to notice, who might not hear unless you shout loud enough. This is no God at all. This is an idol, a projection of human limitation onto the divine, a creation of imagination rather than the creator of all reality. The prophets of Baal continued their frantic efforts through the afternoon, their voices now barely whispers, their bodies exhausted and bloodied. They cried and cut themselves until the time for the evening sacrifice approached. But there was no voice, no answer, no response whatsoever. The silence from heaven was absolute and damning. Then it was Elijah's turn. In the gathering evening light, before a crowd that had watched hours of futile religious theatre, he set about repairing the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, a powerful reminder of national identity, of who they once were, who they were meant to be. Even in their divided and apostate state, they were still the 12 tribes, still the covenant people, still called to be God's own possession. He arranged the wood carefully, prepared the sacrifice, and then did something that seemed designed to ensure failure. He ordered that 4 large jars of water be poured over the offering and the wood. This was done once, then twice, then a third time. Water ran down over the altar, soaking the wood until it seemed impossible that it could ever burn, filling the trench he had dug around the altar until it resembled a small moat. In a land that had seen no rain for 3 years, where every drop of water was precious beyond measure, this seemed like madness or mockery. But Elijah was making a point. When God moved, there would be no room for doubt, no possibility of natural explanation, no way to dismiss what happened as coincidence or trickery. The moment had come. The crowd fell silent. The prophets of Baal stood exhausted and defeated. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colours that would soon give way to darkness. And in that charged silence, Elijah stepped forward to pray. His prayer was remarkable for what it was not. It was not loud or frantic. It was not lengthy or elaborate. There was no cutting, no dancing, no theatrical display. He simply stood before the altar and spoke to God as one would speak to someone present and listening. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Israel," he began, grounding his appeal in the covenant relationship, in the promises made to the fathers. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command." This was crucial. Elijah was not acting on his own authority, pursuing his own agenda, trying to make a name for himself. He was a servant following orders, a messenger delivering a message that had originated with God himself. "Answer me, Lord, answer me," he continued, "so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." Notice what Elijah asked for. Not vindication for himself, not judgment on his enemies, but that the people would know God and experience the turning of their hearts. The entire spectacle, the entire contest, had one purpose: restoration. God wanted his people back. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Fire fell from heaven. Not a small flame slowly kindled, not a gradual ignition, but a consuming inferno that descended with terrible swiftness and power. It devoured the sacrifice, the wood, the stones of the altar, the dust around it, and even the water in the trench. Nothing remained but scorched earth and the undeniable evidence of divine intervention. The people fell on their faces, the cry bursting from thousands of throats simultaneously. "The Lord, he is God! The Lord, he is God!" It was confession, recognition, repentance, and worship, all in one overwhelming moment. Everything they had witnessed over the previous hours, the impotence of Baal, the futility of human religious effort, the terrifying power of the living God, crystallized into that single cry of acknowledgement. What followed was swifter justice. The prophets of Baal, who had led the nation astray, who had grown fat on royal patronage while the people starved, who had promised what they could not deliver, they were seized and executed. It was brutal, but it was also necessary. The cancer had to be cut out if the body was to heal. Then, finally, after 3 years of drought, Elijah told Ahab that rain was coming. He climbed to the top of Carmel, bent down to the ground, and put his face between his knees in prayer. 7 times he sent his servant to look toward the sea. 7 times the servant returned with the same report. Nothing. But on the 7th time a cloud appeared on the horizon, small as a man's hand. That small cloud grew rapidly into a massive storm system. The sky grew black with clouds. The wind rose and rain began to fall in a deluge that must have seemed like the heavens themselves had burst open. 3 years of withheld blessing came pouring down in torrents. Ahab rushed to his chariot to reach Jezreel before the rain made the roads impassable, and Elijah, strengthened by the power of the Lord, ran ahead of the king's chariot, covering the distance on foot faster than horses could pull the royal conveyance. It was a moment of complete triumph. The drought was broken, the false prophets defeated, the people acknowledging God once more. Elijah appeared unstoppable, invincible, a living symbol of what unwavering faith could accomplish. Surely now the nation would turn back to God. Surely now the reforms would begin. Surely now everything would change. But triumph, as Elijah would very soon discover, is no guarantee against despair. And the greatest threats sometimes come not from the battlefield, but from the quiet moments afterward, when the adrenaline fades and reality sets in. Chapter 2. The Threat That Breaks Him. News of the events on Mount Carmel reached the palace quickly. King Ahab returned to Jezreel and recounted to his wife everything that had transpired. The contest, the fire from heaven, the death of her prophets. One might have expected the queen to be chastened by such a display of divine power. Instead, she was enraged. Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah with a chilling declaration. By this time tomorrow, she vowed, his life would be like the lives of those prophets he had executed. It was not a veiled threat or a political maneuver. It was a promise of death, delivered with the cold certainty of one who held absolute power and had never known defeat. Something within Elijah shattered at that moment. Just hours earlier, he had stood fearless before hundreds of false prophets and an entire nation. He had challenged the religious establishment, mocked their impotence, and witnessed the spectacular vindication of God's power. He had been invincible. Now, confronted with the threat of one woman, he did something that seemed incomprehensible. He ran. This is where the humanity of Elijah emerges in stark relief. This is where the story becomes not just ancient history, but a mirror in which we can see our own reflections. Because fear does not always make sense. Burnout does not follow logical patterns. The mind and body, pushed beyond their limits, can break in unexpected ways. Elijah had spent years standing alone, years of being hunted, hiding, relying on God for supernatural provision, years of carrying the weight of an entire nation's spiritual crisis on his shoulders. The confrontation on Carmel had been the culmination of all that pressure, all that responsibility. And while God had shown up powerfully, Elijah had poured everything he had into that moment. Now there was nothing left. The adrenaline had faded. The crowd had dispersed. The fire had gone out. And in its place came the realization that despite everything, despite the miracles, despite the rain, despite the public acknowledgement of God's supremacy, the fundamental situation had not changed. The queen still wanted him dead. The forces of evil were still in power. The fight was far from over. And Elijah, simply, had no more fight to give. So he ran. He took his servant and fled south, past Beersheba, to the very edge of inhabited land. Then he sent his servant back and continued alone into the wilderness, walking into the vast emptiness as if trying to disappear into the landscape itself. Chapter 3. The Wilderness Collapse. The wilderness of the ancient Near East was not merely remote, it was deadly. A place of scorching sun that could blister skin and boil blood, of bitter nights when temperatures plunged and warmth became a desperate need. It was territory of venomous creatures that lurked beneath rocks, of jackals and hyenas that prowled in the darkness, of waterless wastes where a man could walk for days without finding so much as a muddy pool to sustain life. It was where the unprepared went to die, where the lost were never found, where bones bleached white under the relentless sun became indistinguishable from the stones they lay among. Elijah walked into this desolation deliberately, seeking not escape but erasure, not refuge but release. How far he travelled into that wasteland we are not told. Far enough that civilization became a memory, that the sounds of human habitation faded into utter silence, far enough that hope, if any remained, could find no foothold in the barren landscape around him. He came finally to a solitary broom tree, one of the few plants hardy enough to survive in such harsh conditions. Its sparse shade offered minimal relief from the relentless sun, its twisted branches a testament to the struggle for existence in this unforgiving environment. There, beneath that pathetic excuse for shelter, Elijah collapsed. The collapse was total. Physical, emotional, spiritual, psychological. His body, pushed beyond its limits by days of travel with inadequate food and water, simply gave out. But the physical exhaustion was nothing compared to the interior devastation. The man who had stood firm before kings, who had called down fire from heaven, who had outrun chariots in supernatural strength, now lay broken in the dust like a discarded garment, and he prayed. But this was not the confident prayer of Mount Carmel, not a prophetic declaration of God's sovereignty, not an intercession for the people of Israel. This was a prayer of absolute desolation, stripped of everything except raw, wounded honesty. "I have had enough, Lord," he said. 4 simple words that contained an ocean of pain. "Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." Those words carry a weight that echoes across centuries, resonating with anyone who has ever reached the absolute end of their endurance. I have had enough. Not enough victory, not enough provision, not enough evidence of God's power, but enough pain, enough fear, enough of the crushing weight of standing alone, enough of fighting battles that seem to produce no lasting change, enough of being Elijah, the prophet, the lonely voice crying in a wilderness that refused to listen. This moment demands our careful attention because it reveals something crucial about spiritual exhaustion that religious culture often wants to hide or explain away. Elijah was not turning his back on God. He was not denying what he had witnessed or experienced. He had not lost his faith in God's existence or power. But he had lost something perhaps even more fundamental. He had lost his ability to continue. This is burnout in its purest, most devastating form. Not rebellion against God's authority, not doubt in the traditional sense of questioning God's existence or goodness, but a profound, bone-deep weariness that makes even the next breath feel like an impossible burden, the next step an insurmountable obstacle. Consider what Elijah had endured. For 3 years he had lived as a fugitive, dependent on divine provision for survival. He had hidden by a brook, fed by ravens, birds considered unclean, scavengers, yet serving as God's delivery system for bread and meat. When the brook dried up, he had been sent to Zarephath, to a widow's house, where he witnessed her last measure of oil and flour become supernaturally sustained, where he raised her son from death. Then came the confrontation on Carmel, the mental and emotional energy required to stand alone before hundreds of false prophets, before a hostile king, before a nation that had largely abandoned the faith of their fathers. The stress of that moment would have been crushing. The relief when fire fell, when the people acknowledged God, when rain returned. That release of tension might have been almost as overwhelming as the tension itself. And now, mere hours later, a single threat from a queen had undone it all. The victory suddenly seemed hollow. The miracle seemed meaningless. If Jezebel still ruled, if the structures of idolatry remained intact, if his life was still in danger despite everything God had done, what had been accomplished? What had changed? Elijah had given everything, his safety, his comfort, his youth, his very identity, to serving God and calling Israel back to faithfulness. And now, convinced that it had all been futile, that he stood alone as the last believer in a dying faith, he simply wanted it to end. "I am no better than my ancestors," he said. This was not false humility. It was the cry of a man who believed he had failed in the mission that defined his existence. His ancestors had struggled and ultimately died without seeing the fulfillment of God's promises. Now Elijah saw himself in the same position. One more name in a long line of people who had tried and failed to turn Israel's heart back to God. The despair was complete. The darkness was total. And in that darkness, Elijah did the only thing his exhausted body could manage. He slept. The sleep of the utterly depleted. The sleep of one who has nothing left to give and nowhere left to go. The sleep of someone who hoped, perhaps, that rest might become permanent, that closing his eyes might mean never having to open them again to face another day of futile struggle. But God had other plans, and his response to his broken prophet would reveal something fundamental about divine character that transforms how we understand both faith and failure. Chapter 4. God's Gentle Provision. What happened next is remarkable not for its drama but for its tenderness. God did not appear in a whirlwind to rebuke Elijah for his fear. Fire did not descend to shock him back to courage. Thunder did not roll to remind him of divine power. Instead, an angel touched him, gently. "Get up and eat," the angel said. Elijah opened his eyes to find bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. Simple provisions, basic sustenance. Nothing miraculous about the food itself, nothing spectacular about the presentation, just what a weary body needed to survive another day. Elijah ate and drank, then lay down again and slept. The angel did not force him to move on immediately, did not demand he snap out of his depression and return to his prophetic duties. The angel let him rest. Then, a second time, the angel touched him. "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." Notice what is not said here. No lecture about faith, no reminder of past victories, no accusation of cowardice or weak character. Instead, an acknowledgement of reality. The journey is too much for you. Your exhaustion is real. Your limits are valid. You need rest, you need food, you need care. This is God's first response to his burned-out prophet. Not correction, but compassion. Not a spiritual pep talk, but physical provision. Before addressing Elijah's theological misunderstandings or emotional despair, God attends to his basic human needs. There is profound theology in this moment. It affirms that we are not merely spiritual beings, we are embodied souls, and our physical state affects our spiritual capacity. God, who created us, understands this completely. He knows that exhaustion clouds judgment, that hunger magnifies despair, that sleep deprivation distorts perspective. So he feeds his prophet. He lets him rest. Twice. Until Elijah has regained just enough strength to take the next step, not back into ministry, not back into confrontation, but toward God himself. Strengthened by that food, Elijah travelled 40 days and 40 nights. The number itself is significant, echoing Moses' time on Mount Sinai, Israel's years in the wilderness. It was a journey of transformation, though Elijah did not yet know it. He travelled to Horeb, the mountain of God, the very place where centuries earlier Moses had encountered the burning bush and received the law. Elijah found a cave and went inside. There, in the darkness, he waited. For what? He might not have known. Perhaps for answers, perhaps for an end, perhaps simply because he had nowhere else to go. Chapter 5. The Journey to Horeb. The 40-day journey to Horeb was more than a geographical movement. It was a pilgrimage into the deepest questions of faith and purpose. With each step across the harsh terrain, Elijah carried the weight of his disillusionment, the burden of his perceived failure. Mount Horeb, also known as Sinai, was sacred ground. It was where Moses had received the 10 Commandments, where God had revealed his name and character to his people, where the covenant had been established in thunder and lightning and thick clouds. If there was anywhere on earth where one might expect to encounter God directly, it was here. Elijah entered a cave in the mountain, perhaps the very cleft in the rock where Moses had been sheltered when the glory of God passed by. In that enclosed darkness he settled in to wait. The cave became a womb of sorts, a place of hiddenness and safety, but also of isolation and uncertainty. Then the voice came. Not harsh or accusatory, but searching. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" It was a question that penetrated to the core. What are you doing here? Not where you should be. Ministering to Israel. Not standing against the prophets of Baal. Not speaking truth to power. Here, in a cave, hiding after everything God has done. But the question was not meant to shame. It was an invitation. An opening for Elijah to speak his truth, to voice the pain he had been carrying, to finally articulate the despair that had driven him from the heights of Carmel to the depths of the wilderness. Chapter 6. Elijah's Honest Answer. Elijah's response came from a place of raw honesty. There was no attempt to spiritualize his fear, no religious language to dress up his desperation. He simply told God what he felt was true. "I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty," he began. And this was not boasting. It was establishing his credentials, his identity, his life's work. "The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword." Here was the heart of his anguish. He had given everything, risked everything, and it seemed to have changed nothing. The people had witnessed undeniable proof of God's power on Mount Carmel, yet the structures of idolatry remained intact. The queen still ruled. The temples of Baal still stood. The faithful were still hunted. "I am the only one left," Elijah continued, "and now they are trying to kill me too." In Elijah's mind, he had become the last faithful remnant of an entire nation. The weight of that burden, believing that the entire covenant relationship between God and Israel rested on his shoulders alone, had crushed him. And now even he, the last one, was being hunted like an animal. The loneliness in those words is staggering. To believe yourself completely alone in your faith, to see no allies, no fellow warriors, no one who shares your burden or understands your calling, to feel that if you fall, everything falls with you. But Elijah's perception, though deeply felt, was not accurate, and God was about to reveal just how distorted his perspective had become under the weight of exhaustion and fear. Chapter 7. The Wind, the Earthquake, and the Fire. God's response to Elijah's complaint was surprising. He did not immediately correct Elijah's misunderstanding or reassure him with words. Instead, he gave an instruction. "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Elijah emerged from the cave and stood on the mountainside. What happened next must have seemed familiar, even expected. After all, Elijah had seen God work in spectacular ways before. He had witnessed supernatural provision, had called down fire from heaven, had seen rain return after years of drought. He knew God as a God of power, of dramatic intervention, of unmistakable signs. A wind came, but not just any wind, a wind so powerful it tore the mountains apart and shattered rocks. The very foundations of the earth seemed to groan under its force. Trees were uprooted, boulders tumbled down mountainsides, the air itself became a weapon of destruction. But the scripture records something unexpected. The Lord was not in the wind. Before Elijah could fully process this, an earthquake struck. The ground beneath his feet heaved and buckled. Crevasses opened in the rock. The mountain itself shuddered with such violence that standing upright became nearly impossible. It was the kind of seismic event that topples cities, that reshapes landscapes, that leaves survivors traumatized for generations. But again, the scripture is clear. The Lord was not in the earthquake. Then came fire. Not the controlled fire of an altar or the warming fire of a hearth, but wild, consuming flame that swept across the mountainside. Elijah had seen fire from heaven before, spectacular, unmistakable, the very signature of divine power. Surely God would speak through this element that had validated his prophet's ministry on Mount Carmel. But once more, the verdict was the same. The Lord was not in the fire. Each of these manifestations would have been enough to command attention, to inspire awe, to demonstrate power beyond human comprehension. They were exactly the kind of displays that Elijah had come to associate with God's presence and activity. They were dramatic, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. Yet in each case, God's word to his prophet was negative. Not here, not in this. I am not in the spectacle you expect. Chapter 8. The Still Small Voice. After the fire, the chaos, the deafening demonstrations of raw power, something else came. Or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that something else was revealed, something that had been there all along but could only be perceived in the absence of noise and fury. Silence. Deep, profound, complete silence. The kind of silence that settles after a storm, when even the wind seems to hold its breath, when the world itself appears to pause in anticipation. And in that silence, a sound. But not a sound in the ordinary sense. The Hebrew phrase used here is difficult to translate perfectly. Some versions call it a still small voice. Others render it a gentle whisper, or a soft murmuring sound, or even the sound of sheer silence. It was something barely audible, easily missed, requiring complete attention to perceive. When Elijah heard it, or perhaps felt it, or recognized it in some way beyond ordinary hearing, he immediately pulled his cloak over his face. This was the gesture of one standing in the direct presence of the holy, the instinctive response of a human confronted with the divine. He had not covered his face during the wind or the earthquake or the fire, but this gentle whisper, this quiet sound, this was where he encountered God himself. He went and stood at the mouth of the cave, still covered, still overwhelmed by the realization of what he was experiencing, and the voice came again, asking the same question as before. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah gave the same answer. Word for word he repeated his complaint about his zeal, Israel's rejection, the death of the prophets, his isolation, the threat against his life. His circumstances had not changed. His feelings had not suddenly evaporated. He was still afraid, still exhausted, still convinced of his own solitude. But something fundamental had shifted. In the wind and earthquake and fire, God had deconstructed Elijah's expectations about how he works. The God who could send fire from heaven to consume a sacrifice, who could shut up the sky for 3 years and then open it with torrential rain, who could do anything with spectacular power, this God chose to speak in a whisper. The lesson was profound. God's presence is not measured by the volume of his voice or the drama of his intervention. The quiet word is no less divine than the earthquake. The gentle whisper carries no less authority than the thunder. In fact, the whisper requires something the earthquake does not. Stillness, attention, a willingness to listen carefully. Chapter 9. Correction without condemnation. God's response to Elijah's repeated complaint was direct but remarkably gentle. There was no rebuke for his fear, no criticism of his flight into the wilderness. Instead, God gave him concrete direction and corrected his distorted perspective. "Go back the way you came," God instructed. The journey was not over. The calling had not been rescinded. There was still work to do, still purpose to fulfill. Elijah was to anoint new leaders, Hazael as king over Aram, Jehu as king over Israel, and Elisha to succeed him as prophet. These were not minor assignments. They were nation-shaping tasks, the kind of responsibilities given to someone God still trusted, still valued, still intended to use. Elijah, who had believed himself finished, was being told he had essential work yet to complete. But then came the revelation that addressed the very heart of Elijah's despair. "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him." 7,000. Faithful. Hidden perhaps, scattered certainly but present. Real. Elijah was not alone. He had never been alone. While he had focused on the prophets of Baal, on Jezebel's threats, on the apparent triumph of idolatry, God had preserved a remnant of thousands who remained faithful. Elijah's perception had been shaped by exhaustion and isolation. He had lost sight of the bigger picture, had allowed his fear to narrow his vision until all he could see was enemies and opposition. But his limited perspective did not change the reality of what God was doing. This is perhaps the gentlest correction imaginable. God did not shame Elijah for his ignorance, or accuse him of faithlessness for not knowing about these 7,000. He simply revealed the truth. You're not the only one. You never were. The burden you thought was yours alone has been shared all along by thousands of others. The relief of this revelation must have been overwhelming. The crushing weight of believing himself, the last faithful servant, a burden that had driven him to despair and thoughts of death, was lifted by the simple truth that he was part of something larger than he had imagined. Chapter 10. Renewal and New Purpose. Elijah descended from the mountain a different man than the one who had ascended. Not because his circumstances had changed. Jezebel still ruled. The forces of idolatry still held power in Israel. But because his perspective had been transformed. He returned north, travelling back through the wilderness he had fled through in terror. But this time he travelled with purpose, with direction, with a mission that extended beyond himself. He was going to find his successor, to begin preparing the next generation, to invest in someone who would carry on the work when he was gone. He found Elisha son of Shaphat ploughing a field with 12 yoke of oxen. Elisha was a man of some means, engaged in the ordinary work of agriculture, with no apparent expectation that his life was about to change forever. Elijah approached and threw his cloak around him, a symbolic gesture of calling and authority. Elisha understood immediately. He asked only for permission to say goodbye to his parents, then burned his ploughing equipment and slaughtered his oxen, using the wood from the yoke to cook the meat. It was a gesture of complete commitment, of burning bridges, of irrevocable change. Then he set out to follow Elijah and became his servant. This moment marked a profound shift in Elijah's story. For years he had operated alone, the solitary prophet standing against an entire nation's apostasy. Now he had a companion, a student, someone to invest in and mentor. The burden that had seemed unbearable in isolation became manageable when shared. The remainder of Elijah's ministry, as recorded in Scripture, shows a different kind of prophet. Still bold, still faithful, but no longer carrying the crushing weight of solitary responsibility. When he confronted King Ahab again, when he pronounced judgment on Jezebel, when he continued to call Israel back to God, he did so knowing he was part of a larger movement, connected to thousands of faithful believers, and preparing someone to carry on after him. Years later, when it came time for Elijah to depart from this earth, he did not simply die and disappear like other mortals. Instead, in a moment of spectacular divine intervention, one final display of supernatural power, he was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind of fire. But by that time, Elisha was ready. The mantle literally fell to him, and he carried on the prophetic ministry, performing twice as many recorded miracles as his mentor. Elijah's legacy was not primarily in the miracles he performed or the confrontations he won. It was in the faithfulness he demonstrated even in his weakness, and in the successor he prepared to continue the work. Epilogue: A God who meets us gently. The story of Elijah and the still small voice reverberates through the centuries because it speaks to an experience that transcends time and culture, the experience of spiritual exhaustion, of faith tested not by persecution but by weariness, of discovering that even great victory does not guarantee immunity from fear and despair. Elijah was not a superhero. He was a human being who experienced the full range of human emotion, courage and fear, triumph and despair, strength and utter collapse. His faith in God was real, but it did not make him invulnerable to burnout. His calling was genuine, but it did not prevent him from reaching the end of his endurance. What makes his story so valuable is what it reveals about God's character. When Elijah fell apart, God did not abandon him. When he ran in fear, God did not disqualify him. When he prayed for death, God responded with bread and water and rest. God met Elijah in his weakness, with provision before correction. He addressed Elijah's physical needs before confronting his theological misunderstandings. He allowed him time and space to recover before sending him back into service. And when he finally spoke, it was not with the spectacular displays of power that Elijah had come to expect, but with a gentle whisper that required stillness and attention to hear. This is the God Christians worship today. Not a God who demands perfection before offering help. Not a God who responds to exhaustion with rebuke. Not a God who speaks only in dramatic moments of obvious intervention, but a God who understands our limitations, who meets us in our weakness, who sometimes speaks most clearly in the quiet moments when we are finally still enough to listen. The lesson of Elijah's cave is that God is present not only in the mountaintop experiences, the answered prayers, the visible victories. He is equally present in the wilderness collapses, the dark nights of the soul, the moments when we have nothing left to give and nowhere left to go. Sometimes God speaks through fire from heaven. Sometimes he speaks through a whisper so gentle that only the broken can hear it. Both are equally divine. Both are equally powerful. Both are equally valid encounters with the living God. For anyone who has experienced burnout, who has felt the weight of standing alone, who has wondered whether their faith is strong enough or their strength is sufficient, Elijah's story offers profound hope. It says that your exhaustion does not disqualify you. Your fear does not negate your calling. Your humanity does not disappoint your God. It says that when you collapse under the weight of your burdens, God will provide what you need to take the next step. When you feel utterly alone, you are connected to more fellow believers than you can see. When the spectacular moments of victory give way to quiet desperation, God has not left. He is simply speaking in a different register, calling you to a different kind of attention. The still, small voice is not a lesser form of divine communication. It is the voice that calls us beyond spectacle to intimacy, beyond power to presence, beyond doing to being. It is the voice that says, I am here, I have always been here, even when you cannot feel it, even when you cannot see it, even when the wind and earthquake and fire fill your world with noise and chaos. I am here, in the silence, waiting for you to be still enough to hear. This is the God who spoke to Elijah. This is the God who speaks to us still, not only in our moments of strength and faith, but especially in our moments of weakness and fear. For it is in the whisper, more than in the whirlwind, that we encounter the truth about who he is and who we are. Beloved, limited, exhausted, afraid, and yet called, valued, sustained, and never ever alone. Hey everyone, welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something that would genuinely help us out. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know. Seriously, it makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people who love this kind of content. Also, if you want to, drop a comment telling us what time it is for you right now and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. No pressure though, only if you feel like it. And of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It keeps us going. Alright, let's get into it. A whisper in the darkness. Imagine a night so quiet you can hear the oil lamps flickering. Picture a massive stone sanctuary in the ancient city of Shiloh, where shadows dance across walls that have witnessed centuries of worship. The air is thick with the scent of incense and burning oil, that peculiar combination of cedar smoke and olive essence that clings to sacred spaces. Outside, the wind moves through the hills of Israel like a whispered prayer, carrying with it the distant bleating of sheep settling for the night and the occasional call of a desert owl. Inside, in the sacred chambers near the Ark of the Covenant, a young boy lies sleeping on a simple mat. The stones beneath him still hold the warmth of the day's sun, though the night air has begun to cool. His breathing is steady, deep, the kind of sleep that comes from honest physical labour and a clear conscience. His name is Samuel. This is not a story about miracles that shake mountains or angels descending in blinding light. This is a story about something quieter, something more intimate, something that happens in the space between waking and dreaming, where the boundaries of reality become permeable. It is about a voice in the darkness, a child who learned to listen when the entire world had gone deaf, and a moment that would alter the spiritual trajectory of an entire nation. Because sometimes the most profound truths do not arrive with thunder and earthquake. Sometimes they do not announce themselves with burning bushes or pillars of fire. Sometimes they arrive in whispers, in the stillness between breaths, in the gentle calling of a name spoken 3 times before it is finally understood. What you're about to hear is one of the most mysterious and beautiful moments in ancient scripture. A moment when heaven reached down to touch earth, not through spectacular signs, but through the simple act of calling a child's name in the night. But it is also a story about silence broken, about the end of a spiritual drought, about what happens when the divine decides to speak again after generations of absence. This is the story of Samuel, the boy who heard God speak when the rest of the world had forgotten how to listen. And perhaps, hidden within this ancient narrative, there are questions we have forgotten to ask. Questions about why heaven goes silent. Questions about who gets chosen to break that silence. Questions about whether the voice that called to Samuel in that darkened sanctuary is still calling, still speaking, still searching for those rare individuals who know how to say, "I am listening." Chapter 1. Hannah's Promise. To understand Samuel's calling, we must first understand how he came to be sleeping in that sanctuary. His story begins not with him, but with his mother, a woman named Hannah, who knew the bitter taste of desperation and the hollow ache of prayers that seemed to vanish into an empty sky. In the hill country of Ephraim, in a small village whose name has been lost to history, there lived a man named Elkanah who had 2 wives, as was common in that era. His first wife, Peninnah, had given him several children, sons to carry his name, daughters to arrange in marriage, a legacy written in flesh and blood. His second wife, Hannah, had given him only heartache and unanswered prayers. Year after year, Hannah remained childless, and in a culture where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear children, this was not just a personal grief. It was a social death sentence, a daily humiliation, a question mark hanging over her entire existence. Neighbours would whisper, extended family would exchange knowing glances, even well-meaning friends would offer useless advice, or suggest that perhaps she had offended God in some way, that her barrenness was divine punishment for some unknown sin. Elkanah loved Hannah. The text makes this clear. He would give her double portions at feasts, trying to compensate with material generosity for what biology had denied her. He would ask her with genuine confusion, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" It was a question born of love but blind to understanding. He could not fathom that the issue went deeper than his affection, that Hannah's grief was not about him at all, but about her own sense of purpose, of completion, of being seen as fully human by the society around her. Peninnah, with the cruelty that can only come from insecurity dressed as triumph, would taunt Hannah relentlessly. Every time the family made their annual pilgrimage to the sanctuary at Shiloh to worship and offer sacrifices, Peninnah would remind Hannah of her barrenness. The taunts were not subtle. They were designed to cut deep, to remind Hannah that in the eyes of the world she was incomplete, cursed, forgotten by the very God she came to worship. Peninnah would parade her children before Hannah, would make comments about how blessed she was, would turn every moment of worship into a reminder of Hannah's failure. And Hannah would weep. She would refuse to eat. The pain went beyond physical longing for a child. It touched something deeper, the existential question that haunts anyone who feels overlooked by the divine. Does God see me? Does he hear my prayers? Am I worthy of his attention? Or am I simply background noise in a universe too vast to care about one woman's grief? The pilgrimage to Shiloh was supposed to be a time of joy, of celebration, of renewal. But for Hannah, it became an annual reminder of everything she lacked. Year after year she would go through the motions of worship, while her heart broke quietly in places no one could see. One year, during their pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah could bear it no longer. The weight of accumulated grief, the years of disappointment, the constant humiliation, all of it reached a breaking point. While the rest of the family feasted after the sacrifice, celebrating with wine and roasted meat, Hannah slipped away to the entrance of the sanctuary. She stood there, in the place where earth met heaven, in the threshold between the mundane and the sacred, and she prayed with an intensity that went beyond words. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Her whole body shook with the force of her grief and desperation. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands trembled. This was not the polite, ritualized prayer of public worship. This was raw, unfiltered communion with the divine. This was a woman pouring out her soul, holding nothing back, demanding to be heard by a God who had seemed deaf to her pleas for years. She made a vow that day, one that would echo through generations. If God would grant her a son, she would give him back to God. Not for a season, not for a few years, but for his entire life. The child would be dedicated to divine service from the moment he was weaned. It was the prayer of a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is not something to hold on to, but something to offer back to its source. She was not bargaining with God so much as she was declaring her willingness to participate in something larger than her own desires. Eli, the high priest, sat by the doorpost of the sanctuary and watched this strange woman swaying and muttering. In his aging, perhaps cynical view of human nature shaped by years of dealing with corrupt worshippers and his own corrupt sons, he assumed she was drunk. The accusation was harsh, almost cruel. What are you doing here, intoxicated in the house of the Lord? How dare you bring your drunkenness into this sacred space? Hannah lifted her eyes, and in them Eli saw not the glaze of wine, but the clarity of absolute desperation, the look of someone who has nothing left to lose, who has stripped away all pretense and pride, who stands naked before God with only their need. She explained that she was not drunk, but deeply troubled, pouring out her soul before God. She had been praying out of her great anguish and grief. Something in her words, or perhaps in her eyes, or perhaps in the raw authenticity of her pain, convinced Eli. His response was both blessing and prophecy. Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant what you have asked of him. It is unclear whether Eli knew what he was saying, whether he was simply offering the standard priestly blessing, or whether something moved through him in that moment. Some whisper of the divine speaking through a man who had grown complacent in his religious duties. But the words landed on Hannah like rain on parched earth. Hannah left the sanctuary that day transformed. Her face was no longer downcast. She ate. The grief lifted from her countenance like a fog dispersing under the morning sun. She had been heard, if not by man, then by something infinitely greater. She did not yet have the child she longed for, but she had something perhaps more precious. The certainty that her prayers had reached their destination, that her voice had penetrated the silence, that she mattered to the God she served. Within the year, Hannah conceived. When she gave birth to a son, she named him Samuel, which in Hebrew carries the meaning heard by God, or asked of God, or some translations suggest name of God. The name itself was a testimony, a permanent reminder that this child was an answer to prayer, a gift that came from somewhere beyond the ordinary workings of the world. Every time someone spoke his name, they were acknowledging that this boy represented the moment when heaven responded to earth, when silence gave way to acknowledgement. For the first few years of his life, Samuel remained with Hannah. She nursed him, taught him his first words, held him close during thunderstorms, watched him take his first steps, knowing that each day brought them closer to the moment of separation. She must have memorized the sound of his laugh, the feel of his small hand in hers, the weight of him sleeping against her chest. She was not raising a son to keep, but a son to give away, and that knowledge must have coloured every moment with a bittersweet intensity. When he was old enough to be weaned, somewhere around 3 years old by the customs of that time, Hannah kept her vow. She could have rationalised her way out of it. She could have argued that God understood, that the vow was made in a moment of emotional extremity, that surely keeping her son would be acceptable. But Hannah was a woman who understood that integrity means keeping promises even when they cost you everything. She took Samuel to Shiloh. She brought him before Eli, the same priest who had blessed her years earlier, and she said words that must have torn her heart even as she spoke them. I am the woman who stood here praying. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." Then Hannah sang, not a lament, but a song of triumph and praise. She sang of God overturning the proud and lifting up the humble. She sang of barren women bearing children and the powerful being brought low. She sang of the Lord bringing death and giving life, bringing down to the grave and raising up. She sang of God judging the ends of the earth, giving strength to his king and exalting his anointed. Her song was radical, revolutionary, a declaration that the God she served delighted in reversing the expectations of the world, in using the weak to shame the strong, in lifting up those the world had written off as irrelevant. And then she left her son in that sanctuary and went home. Imagine being that child, too young to fully understand why your mother brought you to this vast, echoing building filled with strange smells and unfamiliar faces and then walked away. Too young to grasp that you had become the physical embodiment of a promise, a living prayer offered back to its source. You watch her figure receding, growing smaller, disappearing down the road back to the only home you have ever known, and you are left in the care of an old man whose eyes can barely see you, whose own sons are corrupt, in a place that will become your entire world. Samuel's childhood was unlike any other in Israel. While other boys played in fields and learned their father's trades, running through olive groves and swimming in streams, Samuel grew up in the sacred space of the tabernacle. His world was one of ritual and reverence, of ancient objects and whispered prayers, of shadows and lamplight, and the constant awareness that this place was different from all other places. He opened the doors of the sanctuary each morning, flooding the holy space with light. It was his job to unlock the heavy wooden doors that seal the sacred from the profane, to let in the dawn and with it the worshippers who would come seeking connection with the divine. He assisted Eli in the daily tasks of worship, learning the intricate patterns of sacrifice and ceremony, memorizing which offerings required which procedures, understanding the difference between sin offerings and burnt offerings and peace offerings, learning to read the subtleties of ritual purity. He tended the lamps that burned through the night, ensuring their wicks were trimmed and their oil replenished. This was not glamorous work. It required attention to detail, a willingness to wake in the darkness to check that the flames had not guttered out, an understanding that these small acts of maintenance were what kept the sacred space functioning. The lamps represented the presence of God, and Samuel learned that presence requires constant tending, constant attention, constant care. He cleaned the sacred vessels, swept the courts, washed the linens used in ceremonies, helped prepare the incense, carried water, ran errands. He memorized scriptures, learning to recite the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the tales of Moses and the Exodus, the laws given at Sinai. His education was entirely religious, entirely focused on service, entirely oriented towards something beyond himself. By all accounts, Samuel was a good child, humble, obedient, faithful in small things. The text tells us he grew in favour with both the Lord and with people. He was not resentful of his circumstances. He did not seem to chafe against the boundaries of his unusual childhood. Perhaps he had accepted that this was simply who he was, the boy who belonged to God, the boy who lived in the house of the Lord. But what must it have been like psychologically? To have no mother to comfort you when you woke from nightmares, to have no siblings to quarrel and play with, to grow up watching Eli's corrupt sons come and go, seeing the way they abused their position, hearing the whispers of their misconduct, to be surrounded by holiness and yet witness its corruption, to serve faithfully while those who should have been models of righteousness displayed only greed and lust and contempt for the sacred. Did Samuel wonder why he had been left here? Did he feel abandoned by the mother who had kissed him goodbye and walked away? Did he question whether the God he served even noticed his small acts of service? The text does not tell us. We see only the external facts, a boy growing up, performing his duties, learning his role. But surely there were moments of loneliness, moments of doubt, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy for small shoulders to carry. Hannah visited when she could. Each year during the family's annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, she would bring Samuel a new robe she'd made for him, watching him grow, trying to compress a year of mothering into a few brief encounters. These visits must have been both blessing and torment. The joy of seeing his mother mingled with the pain of watching her leave again. The new robe a reminder that somewhere he had a home, a family, a life he was not permitted to live. Yet there is no indication that Samuel rebelled or resented his circumstances. He simply continued. Day after day, year after year, faithful in the small things, present in the sacred space, available to be used however God saw fit. There was no indication in those early years that he would become anything more than a helpful assistant to an aging priest, that he would one day be the voice through which God spoke to an entire nation. But God, it seems, has a habit of preparing his instruments in obscurity before bringing them into the light. Samuel was being shaped by his circumstances, formed by his loneliness, refined by his faithfulness in tasks that no one celebrated. He was learning what it meant to serve without applause, to be obedient without immediate reward, to remain present even when presence felt like punishment. He was learning to listen in the silence. Chapter 2. The State of Israel at the Time. To appreciate what happened on that quiet night when God called Samuel's name, you need to understand the spiritual condition of Israel during this period. It was, to put it simply, a disaster. But the disaster raises uncomfortable questions that the text never fully answers. Questions about divine silence. Questions about why systems of worship become corrupt. Questions about what happens when the mediators between heaven and earth become obstacles instead of conduits. The problem started with Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. These two men had inherited their father's position as priests, but they had not inherited his reverence for the sacred. They were corrupt in ways that went beyond simple moral failing. They actively perverted the worship of God, treating the sacrifices and offerings as opportunities for personal gain, turning the sacred into the profane with a systematic cruelty that suggests something darker than mere greed. When people brought animals to sacrifice at Shiloh, the priests were entitled to a specific portion of the meat according to the law of Moses. But Hophni and Phinehas were not content with their allotted share, with what had been designated as rightfully theirs. They wanted more. They wanted the best. They wanted what belonged to God. They would send their servants to threaten worshippers, demanding the choicest cuts of meat before the fat was even burned on the altar, as required by law. The fat belonged to God. That was non-negotiable in the sacrificial system. The burning of the fat was the moment when the sacrifice became truly sacred, when the offering transitioned from human gift to divine acceptance. But Hophni and Phinehas did not care about divine acceptance. They cared about their appetites. If people objected, if they tried to follow the proper procedures and insist that the fat be burned first, the servants would respond with threats of violence. We will take it by force if necessary. The priests were literally stealing from God, taking what belonged to the altar and consuming it themselves. They were turning worship into extortion, using their position of spiritual authority to exploit the vulnerable and the faithful. But their corruption went even darker, into territories that the text only hints at with uncomfortable brevity. They engaged in sexual immorality with women who served at the entrance to the sanctuary. These were women who had dedicated themselves to service at the tabernacle, who came to worship and serve with sincere devotion. And Hophni and Phinehas exploited them, used their authority and position to prey upon those who should have been under their protection. They turned the house of God into a place of exploitation and abuse, where the very people who were supposed to represent divine holiness became perpetrators of trauma. Worship became a source of fear rather than transcendence. People stopped coming, or when they came with cynicism and resentment, going through the motions but empty of faith. How could you trust a system where the gatekeepers were predators? How could you believe in the holiness of a place where the priests defiled it daily? The sanctuary at Shiloh, which was meant to be the central hub of Israel's spiritual life, became instead a monument to religious corruption. Eli knew what his sons were doing. The text makes this painfully clear. People told him. They came with reports of misconduct, of abuse, of exploitation. He heard the rumours and saw the evidence. He was not ignorant. He was not blind to their crimes, and to his credit he confronted them, but his rebukes were weak, almost apologetic, carrying no weight and no consequence. Why do you do such things? I hear reports from the people about your wicked deeds. If someone sins against another person, God may mediate. But if someone sins against the Lord, who will intercede? The words acknowledge the problem but offer no solution. There is no threat of removal from office, no stripping of authority, no punishment that might actually deter the behaviour. Just words, just disappointment, just a father hoping his wayward sons might suddenly develop a conscience they had never demonstrated. Hophni and Phinehas ignored their father and continued their corruption. Why wouldn't they? There were no consequences. Eli's position as high priest gave him the authority to remove them, to appoint others, to enforce standards. But he did nothing, and his inaction was itself a form of action, a choice that enabled the continued degradation of worship. The impact on Israel's spiritual life was catastrophic. The text records it with devastating simplicity. The people came to despise the offerings to the Lord. Think about what that means. The sacrificial system was the heart of Israel's covenant relationship with God. It was how sins were atoned for, how gratitude was expressed, how the community maintained its connection with the divine. And people were learning to despise it, to see it as corrupt and meaningless, to associate worship with exploitation rather than with holiness. Faith withered. Cynicism spread. A generation was growing up believing that God either did not care about corruption in his own house, or that he was powerless to stop it, or worse, that he did not exist at all, and the whole system was simply a mechanism for priestly power and exploitation. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this era, the detail that haunts the narrative with its implications, was not the corruption of the priests. It was the silence of heaven. The scripture records it with haunting simplicity. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. Think about what that means. In a culture where prophets and priests were meant to be the conduits between God and humanity, the channel had gone quiet. God was not speaking, or if he was, no one was hearing. Prophecies were scarce to the point of being legendary. Divine visions were so uncommon that when someone claimed to have received one, it was met with skepticism rather than expectation. But why? The text does not explain. It simply records the fact of divine silence as if it were weather, as if the absence of God's voice was as natural and unremarkable as a drought. But this raises uncomfortable questions. Had God withdrawn because of the corruption? Was the silence a form of judgment, a divine turning away from a people who had corrupted worship? Or had the people simply stopped listening? Had they become so cynical and so wounded by a religious hypocrisy that they could no longer hear what was being said? Or was there another possibility, one that the text does not explore but that hangs in the air like smoke? Perhaps the priests, who were supposed to be the mediators between God and people, had become such effective blockers of communication that divine messages simply could not get through. Perhaps Hophni and Phinehas were not just corrupt individuals, but symptoms of a systemic failure, a spiritual infrastructure that had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Israel was spiritually adrift, navigating by dead reckoning through waters where the stars had gone dark. There were no prophets to consult, no clear word from God about how to proceed, no divine guidance about which way to turn, just the daily grind of existence, the hollow rituals performed without meaning, the slow death of a people's faith in the face of institutional betrayal. This was the world into which Samuel was growing up, a world where the representatives of God were corrupt, where worship had become hollow, where heaven seemed distant and disinterested. If you were a young person in that era, what would you believe about the divine? Would you expect God to speak? Would you even know what his voice sounded like? Would you be able to distinguish a divine call from your own imagination or from the voice of a very human priest? Samuel cleaned the lamps each evening, ensuring the light would burn through the night. It was a practical task, a maintenance duty, nothing spiritual about it. He trimmed the wicks, refilled the oil reservoirs, ensured the flames were steady. But in that small act, there was a symbol that perhaps Samuel himself did not fully understand. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Somewhere in the darkness a light still burned, and into that darkness, cutting through the silence that had lasted for generations, a voice was about to break through. Chapter 3. The night God spoke. The night began like any other. Samuel had completed his duties for the day, working through the familiar routines that structured his life. The sanctuary was clean, the floors swept, the vessels washed and arranged in their proper places. The lamps were lit, their flames steady, casting dancing shadows across the ancient stones. The sacred space was prepared for the silence of the evening hours, for the long watch through darkness toward dawn. Eli, now elderly and nearly blind, his eyes grown dim from age and perhaps from seeing too much corruption without acting, had retired to his usual place. He moved slowly now, carefully, feeling his way along walls he had walked beside for decades. His sleeping area was separate but nearby, close enough that Samuel could hear him if he called, out in the night. Samuel lay down in his customary sleeping spot somewhere near the chamber where the Ark of the Covenant rested. The exact location is not specified in the text, but the implication is clear. He slept in proximity to the most sacred object in all of Israel, closer to the physical representation of God's presence than anyone else in the nation that night. The Ark was the most sacred object in Israel, a gold-covered chest containing the tablets of the law, a jar of manna, and Aaron's staff that had budded. But more than its contents, the Ark represented the very presence of God among his people. It was the throne of the invisible King, the place where heaven touched earth, the point of contact between the divine and the mortal. To sleep near it was to sleep in the shadow of holiness, though Samuel likely thought nothing of it. This was simply where he slept, as ordinary to him as any bedroom, as familiar as his own breathing. The lamp of God was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. This detail matters more than it might initially seem. In the Jewish tradition, the lamp in the sanctuary, the menorah that burned with consecrated oil, was not allowed to go out until morning light made it unnecessary. It represented the presence of God, the light that persisted even in darkness, the hope that had not yet been extinguished. The phrase, "the lamp of God had not yet gone out," carries within it both promise and warning. Not yet, but it could. The light was still burning, but barely. The presence was still there, but fading. As long as the lamp burned, there was hope. As long as the light persisted against the encroaching darkness, God had not abandoned his dwelling place entirely. Samuel drifted into sleep, a boy exhausted from the honest labour of serving in the house of God. His breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed. He sank into that deep, dreamless sleep that comes from physical work and a clear conscience. The sanctuary around him settled into its nighttime sounds. The creak of cooling stone, the whisper of wind through high windows, the distant cry of a night bird, the soft flutter of the lamp flames, and then, in the darkness, cutting through the silence like a knife through cloth, he heard his name, Samuel. The voice was clear, distinct, personal. Not a shout that would echo through the halls, but not a whisper that could be mistaken for imagination either. It had the quality of someone standing nearby, speaking with intention and purpose, with the certainty that they would be heard. It was a voice that expected a response. Samuel's eyes snapped open. His heart leaped in his chest. There was no confusion, no moment of disorientation. He knew immediately that someone had called him. The voice had been too clear, too deliberate, too unmistakably directed at him. In the darkness, with the lamp casting its uncertain light, Samuel did what made perfect sense to a boy who had grown up serving under an elderly priest. Eli must need something. The old priest was nearly blind now, stumbling in the darkness. Perhaps he had dropped something. Perhaps he needed water. Perhaps he was unwell and required assistance. Samuel threw off whatever covering he used against the night chill and ran to where Eli slept. "Here I am. You called me?" The response was immediate, instinctive. Here I am. 2 words that would become the defining posture of Samuel's entire life. Not, what do you want? Not, can it wait until morning? Just presence. Just availability. Here I am. Eli, pulled from sleep and confused, his mind foggy with the remnants of dreams, looked in the direction of Samuel's voice with eyes that could barely make out shapes in the darkness. I did not call. Go back and lie down. Samuel returned to his place, perhaps a little puzzled, but not overly concerned. Perhaps he had been dreaming. Perhaps the transition from sleep to waking had jumbled his perceptions. Perhaps the old man had called out in his sleep and forgotten. These things happen. The mind plays tricks in the boundary spaces between consciousness and unconsciousness. He lay back down, pulled his covering around him, and closed his eyes, willing himself back towards sleep. The sanctuary settled back into silence. The lamp continued its steady burning. Outside, the wind moved through the hills with a sound like breathing. Samuel's heartbeat slowed back to its resting rhythm. Samuel? Again. The same voice, the same clarity, the same undeniable sense that someone was speaking directly to him, calling him by name with purpose and intention. This was not imagination. This was not the remnant of a dream clinging to the edge of waking. This was not the echo of Eli's voice misheard in the darkness. Someone had called his name, clearly and deliberately, as real as the stone beneath him and the lamplight flickering against the walls. Once more, Samuel got up and went to Eli. His bare feet made soft sounds against the cold stone floor. His breathing was quicker now, his confusion deeper. If Eli had not called the first time, then who had? Here I am. You called me. Eli, now more awake and perhaps slightly irritated at being disturbed a second time, sent him away again with a tone that suggested both confusion and mild frustration. I did not call, my son. Go back and lie down. Samuel returned, but now there was a question forming in his mind that would not be silenced. If Eli was not calling him, then who was? Was someone playing a trick? Was there an intruder in the sanctuary hiding in the shadows, calling his name for some unknown purpose? But the voice had not seemed mischievous or threatening. It had been steady, certain, intimate, the kind of voice that knows you, that has the right to call your name. He lay back down, but this time sleep did not come easily. His eyes stayed open, staring into the darkness above him. His ears strained for any sound, any indication of who or what had spoken to him. The lamp flickered. A moth circled near its flame. Time stretched and compressed in that strange way it does when you are lying awake in the dark, unsure whether minutes or hours are passing. Samuel. The third time, Samuel abandoned any doubt or hesitation. Someone was calling him, and if it was not Eli, then perhaps the old priest was confused. Perhaps he was calling out without realizing it. Perhaps his dreams were speaking through him. Samuel got up once more, faster now, urgent, and went to Eli. He stood at the foot of the old priest's sleeping mat, his young face barely visible in the dim light that filtered in from the main chamber. Here I am. You called me. And finally, after decades of serving in the sanctuary, after years of watching the word of the Lord become rare and vision scarce, after witnessing the corruption of his sons and the slow death of Israel's faith, Eli understood. The realization must have hit him like a physical blow. God was calling the boy, not the high priest, not the experienced religious leader, not the man who had served in this place for decades. The boy who cleaned the floors and tended the lamps and slept near the ark without fully comprehending what that meant. Eli's response is one of the most beautiful moments in the entire narrative. He could have been jealous, wounded by the divine bypassing, bitter that his years of service were being overlooked in favour of a child. He could have been defensive, questioning whether this was really happening, whether Samuel was perhaps confused or making things up. He could have claimed the voice for himself, insisted that any divine communication should come through proper channels, through the established hierarchy of priesthood. But instead, Eli became a teacher in the truest sense. He gave Samuel the gift of understanding and the words that would change everything. He put aside whatever personal feelings he might have had and focused entirely on helping Samuel navigate what was about to happen. "Go and lie down," Eli said, and you can hear in those words both resignation and hope, both the sadness of being passed over and the wonder that God was speaking again at all. "And if he calls you, say, 'Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening.'" Those words, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," not "Who are you?" not "What do you want?" not "Prove yourself to me." Just openness, just availability, just the humble acknowledgement that if God is speaking, the only appropriate response is to listen. Samuel returned to his place one more time. He lay down in the darkness, the lamp of God still burning nearby, casting its uncertain light across ancient stones, and he waited. His heart must have been pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His mind must have been racing with questions and fears and wonder. What does the voice of God sound like? What will he say? Am I worthy to hear it? What if I do not understand? What if I get it wrong? The silence stretched. The lamp flickered. Outside, the night continued its slow progression toward dawn. And then, for the fourth time, the voice came. But this time there was a difference. This time the name was repeated, spoken twice, with an intimacy and urgency that had not been there before. "Samuel! Samuel!" The repetition is significant. In Hebrew, when a name is called twice, it indicates intimacy, urgency, importance. Abraham, Abraham, Moses, Moses. Now Samuel, Samuel. This was not a casual summons. This was personal, direct, unmistakable. This time, the boy was ready. Following Eli's instructions exactly, word for word, he responded with the words that have echoed through millennia as the perfect posture of faith, the ideal response to divine initiative. "Speak, for your servant is listening." And God spoke. What happened next was not what a child would want to hear. God did not give Samuel a message of encouragement or blessing. He did not reveal some beautiful mystery or share some cosmic secret about the nature of reality or the structure of heaven. He did not offer comfort or promise Samuel a glorious future. Instead, God gave Samuel a prophecy of judgment, and the judgment was against Eli's household, against the man who had been like a father to him, against the only family he had truly known. God told Samuel that he was about to do something in Israel that would make the ears of everyone who heard it tingle. That phrase, "ears tingling," suggests something shocking, something that would reverberate through the nation like a physical sensation. This was not going to be a quiet judgment, a private correction. This was going to be public, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. He was going to carry out against Eli everything he had spoken concerning his family, from beginning to end. There had been warnings before. A prophet had come to Eli years earlier with a similar message, speaking of judgment to come, of the priesthood being taken from his lineage, of his sons dying on the same day. That prophecy had been spoken and then seemingly forgotten, filed away as one of those uncomfortable truths that people acknowledge but never really expect to see fulfilled. But God was saying now that the time of fulfillment had come. The warnings were over. The judgment was at hand. The reason was clear and devastating. Eli knew about the sins of his sons. He knew they were blaspheming God, treating the sacred as profane, exploiting women, stealing from the altar, corrupting worship itself. He had heard the reports. He had seen the evidence. He had confronted them, yes, but his rebukes were empty, carrying no weight, leading to no consequences. He had failed to restrain them, failed to use his authority to stop them, failed to choose God's honour over his son's comfort, and that failure, that complicity through inaction, meant that the guilt of Eli's house would never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Think about what that means. In a religious system built entirely around sacrifice and atonement, where every sin could theoretically be covered by the blood of animals and the proper rituals, God was declaring that some corruption runs too deep for ritual to reach. Some betrayals are so fundamental that the system itself cannot address them. Eli's family would carry their guilt to the grave and beyond, marked forever by their choice to prioritize family loyalty over divine justice. Imagine being Samuel in that moment. You are a child, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, lying in the darkness of a sanctuary, having just heard the voice of God for the first time in your life. And the message you have been given is not one of blessing or calling or future glory. It is a message of doom for the man who has raised you, who has taught you everything you know about worship and service, who has been your only father figure in a life marked by abandonment and loneliness. The weight of it must have been crushing. How do you speak words of judgment to someone you love? How do you become the bearer of bad news that will break someone's heart? How do you look into the eyes of a man who has shown you kindness and tell him that his family line is cursed, that his sons will die, that everything he has built will crumble? This was the cost of prophecy that no one talks about. This was the burden of truth that cannot be softened or avoided or delayed. Samuel had been given a message, and whether he wanted to deliver it or not was irrelevant. The truth had been spoken to him, and now he was responsible for speaking it to others. This is what it means to be a prophet. Not visions and mystical experiences and spiritual heights, but the grinding, awful responsibility of speaking truths that wound you as deeply as they wound those who hear them. The rest of the night must have been agony for Samuel. The text tells us he lay there until dawn, too afraid to tell Eli what he'd heard. He did not sleep. How could he? His mind must have raced through possibilities. Maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe there was a way to soften the message to make it less harsh. Maybe if he just kept quiet, the whole thing would fade like a dream, and he could go back to his simple life of tending lamps and sweeping floors. But deep down, he knew. The voice had been too clear. The message had been too specific. And God had not asked his opinion about whether this was a good idea or whether Samuel felt ready for such responsibility. The divine does not consult us about our readiness. It simply calls, and we must answer. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Message. As morning light began to filter into the sanctuary, pale and hesitant through the high windows, Samuel rose and went about his duties as usual. Muscle memory guided him through the familiar routines. He opened the doors of the house of the Lord, pushing aside the heavy wooden barriers that sealed the sacred from the profane, letting in the day, with all its ordinary demands. But everything felt different now. The air was heavier, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. The silence was louder, filled with the words he carried but could not speak. He carried within him words that would change everything, and he was terrified to voice them. His hands shook as he performed his tasks. He fumbled with the lamp wicks, nearly spilling oil on the floor. He could not meet anyone's eyes. Every sound made him jump, expecting Eli to call for him, to demand the message, to force him to speak the unspeakable. Eli, however, knew something had happened. Years of serving in the sanctuary had given him an intuition about spiritual matters that his failing eyesight could not diminish. He could sense the change in Samuel, could feel the weight the boy was carrying. He called Samuel to him, his voice gentle but insistent, and when the boy came, reluctant and pale, the old priest asked him directly, "Samuel, my son, what was it he said to you? Please do not hide it from me." Then he added words that carried the weight of both authority and desperation. "May God deal with you, be it ever so severely if you hide from me anything he told you." It was an oath, a binding formula that made concealment impossible. Eli was not giving Samuel an easy out. He was demanding truth, however painful, however devastating. And in doing so, he was teaching Samuel one of the most important lessons of prophetic ministry. That truth matters more than comfort, that integrity requires speaking even when silence would be kinder. There is something deeply moving about this moment. Eli was giving Samuel permission to speak truth, even painful truth. He was not demanding a comfortable answer. He was not pressuring the boy to lie or soften the message. He was not using his position as high priest to intimidate or manipulate. He was simply asking for honesty, for the faithful delivery of whatever word had been given, regardless of personal cost. Samuel, to his credit, did not hold back. He told Eli everything, every word of the judgment, every detail of the coming consequences, every aspect of the doom pronounced against his house. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not try to make it easier to hear. He did not add comforting caveats or suggest ways the judgment might be avoided. He simply delivered the message as it had been given to him, faithful to both God and to Eli in his refusal to distort the truth. The words must have felt like stones in his mouth, each one heavy and sharp. He would have watched Eli's face as he spoke, looking for signs of anger or rejection or denial. But what he saw instead was something he had not expected. Eli's response is remarkable in its humility and resignation. He did not rage against the pronouncement. He did not question Samuel's experience or suggest the boy had misunderstood or imagined things. He did not blame Samuel for being the messenger or accuse him of disloyalty or ingratitude. He simply said, with a weariness that spoke of years of knowing this moment would come, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." There is defeat in those words, yes, but there is also acceptance. A kind of peace that comes from finally having the truth spoken aloud, from no longer living in the shadow of unacknowledged reality. Eli had known for years that his sons were corrupt. He had known that his failure to stop them was a kind of complicity, a betrayal of his calling and his God. The judgment was not a surprise. It was an inevitability finally spoken aloud, a truth that had been hovering unspoken in the air for years finally given voice and substance. And perhaps in some way, Eli was relieved that the silence had been broken, even if the words spoken were words of judgment. Perhaps there is a relief that comes from knowing, from having certainty, even when that certainty is terrible. Perhaps after years of wondering when the hammer would fall, there was a strange comfort in finally hearing it fall, in knowing the shape of the future even when that future was dark. What Samuel learned that night and that morning was something most of us spend a lifetime avoiding. That truth is not always comfortable, that faithfulness sometimes means delivering hard words, and that love does not require us to hide reality from those we care about. Samuel could have lied to Eli. He could have softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details, or suggested that perhaps he had misunderstood what God was saying, but he chose honesty, and in doing so he established the pattern that would define his entire ministry. He would be a prophet who spoke the word of the Lord without compromise, without concern for how it would be received, without fear of the consequences. Not because he was harsh or unfeeling, but because he understood that truth, however painful, is ultimately an act of respect. To lie to someone, even to spare their feelings, is to treat them as less than fully human, as incapable of bearing reality. Samuel gave Eli the dignity of truth, and Eli received it with the dignity of acceptance. Chapter 5. Samuel becomes a prophet. After that night, everything changed for Samuel. The text tells us that he grew, and the Lord was with him, letting none of his words fall to the ground. That phrase, letting none of his words fall to the ground, is the ancient way of saying that everything Samuel prophesied came true. He was not speaking his own opinions or making educated guesses or offering the kind of vague predictions that could be interpreted multiple ways, depending on how events unfolded. He was speaking with divine authority, and reality itself confirmed his words with uncomfortable precision. The prophecy about Eli's house came true exactly as Samuel had spoken it. The details are grim and worth recounting because they establish Samuel's credibility as a true prophet in a time when false prophets were common and people had grown cynical about divine communication. Israel went to war against the Philistines, their perennial enemy. In the first battle, the Israelites were defeated and thousands of soldiers died. In desperation, the elders decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to the battlefield, believing that God's physical presence would guarantee victory. Hophni and Phinehas accompanied the Ark, treating it like a magical talisman rather than the throne of the living God. The Israelites shouted when the Ark arrived, a roar so loud that the ground shook. The Philistines were terrified at first, knowing the stories of what the God of Israel had done to Egypt. But they fought anyway, and in the battle that followed, Israel was utterly defeated. 30,000 soldiers died. and on that same day, exactly as prophesied, both Hophni and Phinehas were killed. The Ark of God was captured by the Philistines, carried off as a trophy of war. When a messenger brought the news to Shiloh, Eli was sitting by the road, his heart trembling for the Ark of God. When he heard that the Ark had been captured and his sons were dead, the 98-year-old priest fell backward off his chair, broke his neck, and died. The priesthood of his line ended in that moment, cut off exactly as God had declared. It was a devastating fulfillment, but it established beyond doubt that Samuel spoke with divine authority. He had predicted these events when he was just a child, and they had come to pass exactly as he said. The word of the Lord through Samuel was reliable, trustworthy, deserving of attention. As Samuel matured from boy to young man, his reputation spread throughout Israel like wildfire. From Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the deep south, spanning the entire geographical extent of Israel's territory, everyone knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord. The word that had been rare, the visions that had been scarce, now flowed through this young man who had learned to listen in the darkness. But Samuel was more than just a prophet delivering occasional messages. God continued to appear at Shiloh, revealing himself to Samuel through his word on a regular basis. Samuel became the primary channel of divine communication for the entire nation. The silence had been broken. The channel between heaven and earth, clogged by corruption and complacency for generations, had been cleared. And the instrument God chose was not a powerful warrior or a cunning politician or even an experienced priest with decades of religious training. It was a boy who had learned to say 5 simple words: "Speak, for your servant is listening." Samuel's influence on Israel cannot be overstated. He became the bridge between the chaotic era of the judges and the establishment of the monarchy, standing at one of the most critical transitions in the nation's history. He was the last judge, travelling on a circuit through Bethel, Gilgal and Mizpah, settling disputes and administering justice with a wisdom that people recognised as coming from God. He was also the first of the great prophets, the founder of a prophetic tradition that would produce Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all the voices that would call Israel back to God throughout its history. When the people demanded a king like the surrounding nations, it was Samuel who anointed Saul, a tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin, as Israel's first king. And when Saul proved disobedient and unfaithful to God, it was Samuel who had to deliver yet another hard message of judgment, who had to watch another man he had elevated fall under divine displeasure. Later, it was Samuel who anointed David, the youngest son of Jesse, a shepherd boy with no apparent qualifications except that God had chosen him. That shepherd boy would become Israel's greatest king, the man whose lineage would eventually produce the Messiah. But beyond the political role, beyond the anointing of kings and the settling of disputes, Samuel represented something Israel desperately needed: spiritual integrity in a world corroded by compromise. In a time when the priesthood had become corrupt, when worship had become hollow, when the word of the Lord was rare, Samuel embodied what it meant to hear from God and speak his truth faithfully regardless of personal cost. He reformed religious life throughout Israel, establishing schools of prophets where young men could learn to listen for God's voice and speak his word. He called the people back to authentic worship, challenging them to put away their foreign gods and serve the Lord only. He led the nation in repentance at Mizpah, where they fasted and confessed their sins, acknowledging that they had abandoned God. And when the Philistines attacked during that gathering, Samuel interceded for the people, and God threw the enemy into confusion with thunder and lightning, giving Israel a decisive victory. Samuel demonstrated that God had not abandoned his people, that the silence had been circumstantial rather than permanent, that divine presence and power was still available to those who would seek them with integrity. The boy who once cleaned floors and trimmed lamp wicks became the conscience of a nation. The child who slept near the ark became the voice through which God spoke to kings and commoners alike. His authority came not from position, or political power, or military might, but from the simple fact that he had learned to listen and had the courage to speak what he heard, even when speaking cost him dearly. Chapter 6. The Legacy of the Story. So what do we take from this ancient narrative? What does it mean for us, centuries removed from oil lamps and tabernacles and sleeping near the Ark of the Covenant? And perhaps more intriguingly, what questions does this story raise that it never fully answers? First, there is the theme of listening. God can speak in quiet places, in ordinary moments, when we least expect it. Samuel was not performing some elaborate spiritual ritual when God called his name. He was not fasting on a mountain. He was not in a trance or a vision quest. He was sleeping, exhausted from a day of mundane labour. He was simply present in a sacred space, available to be awakened. How often do we miss the voice of the divine because we are too busy, too distracted, too convinced that revelation only comes in spectacular packages? We wait for burning bushes and angelic visitations, for dramatic signs and unmistakable interventions, while the still small voice speaks in the darkness and we mistake it for our imagination, or for human conversation, or for nothing at all. Samuel teaches us that sometimes the most profound moments arrive softly, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the darkness when our defences are down and our minds are quiet enough to hear what has always been speaking. But this raises uncomfortable questions. How many times has that voice spoken and we have ignored it? How many times have we attributed divine communication to coincidence or psychology or wish fulfillment because we have lost the ability to recognise it for what it is? Second, there is the theme of obedience. Samuel's first response when he heard his name was immediate and complete. Here I am. No hesitation, no calculation, no weighing of options or considering whether this was a good time, just presence and availability. Not, what do you want, but here I am. Not, let me think about it, but immediate response. Later, when Eli gave him the words to use, Samuel followed the instruction exactly. He did not improvise or try to improve on the formula or insert his own personality into the exchange. He simply said what he had been taught to say: "Speak, for your servant is listening." Obedience in this story is not about blind submission to authority. It is about being teachable, about recognizing when someone knows more than you do, about trusting guidance even when you do not fully understand where it is leading. But there is something deeper here, something that troubles the waters of easy interpretation. Samuel was obedient to a voice he had never heard before, to a presence he could not see, based entirely on the instruction of a priest whose own family was corrupt, and whose judgment had been compromised by his failure to discipline his sons. What made Samuel so certain that this was God speaking and not some other voice? What internal compass guided him toward trust when skepticism would have been equally reasonable? Third, there is the theme of humility. Samuel's greatness began in small acts of service. He was faithful in opening doors, in cleaning, in tending lamps, in all the unglamorous work that keeps a sacred space functioning. He did not despise the small things, or consider himself above menial tasks. He swept floors with the same attention he later brought to anointing kings. He trimmed lamp wicks with the same care he would later exercise in delivering prophetic words, and it was in that posture of humble service, in the daily repetition of small, faithful acts, that God found him. How different this is from our modern obsession with platform and visibility, with making a name for ourselves and ensuring everyone knows our accomplishments, with treating service as a stepping stone to something better rather than as its own reward. Samuel reminds us that true influence is built in obscurity, that character is formed in the small decisions no one sees, that greatness is the fruit of faithfulness in little things rather than the result of ambitious self-promotion. But again, there is a mystery here. Why Samuel? What was it about this particular boy that made him suitable for this calling? The text gives no indication that he was exceptional in any way. He was simply there, simply faithful, simply available. Which raises the question, are there others who are equally faithful, equally available, who never heard their name called? Is divine calling arbitrary, or is there some hidden criteria that determines who hears the voice and who does not? Fourth, there is the theme of responsibility. Sometimes truth is hard but necessary. Samuel's first message from God was a message of judgment, and he had to deliver it to someone he loved. This is the cost of being a conduit for truth. You do not get to choose which messages are convenient and which are difficult. You do not get to edit reality to make it more palatable. You do not get to withhold hard truths, because speaking them might damage relationships or cost you social capital. If you are going to be a voice for something beyond yourself, whether you call that voice God or conscience or truth, or simply what is, you have to be willing to speak even when the words cut you as deeply as they cut those who hear them. Samuel could have spared Eli. He could have lied or softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details. But he chose the harder path of honesty, and in doing so he honoured both Eli and himself. Yet this raises ethical questions that the narrative does not resolve. What is the balance between truth and compassion? When does speaking hard truths become cruelty disguised as honesty? Samuel was a child delivering a message he did not create and could not change. But what about us, when the truths we must speak are filtered through our own perceptions and biases and limited understanding? How do we know when to speak and when to remain silent? Fifth, there is the theme of hope. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Even in the darkest period of Israel's spiritual life, when the priesthood was corrupt and the word of the Lord was rare and the nation was spiritually adrift, there was still a light burning somewhere in the darkness. God had not abandoned his people. He was simply waiting for someone who would listen, someone who would respond, someone who would be faithful with what was given to them. Samuel represents the truth that it is never too late for renewal, that no matter how far things have fallen, no matter how corrupt the systems or how cynical the people, there is always the possibility of a voice in the darkness calling us back to what matters. The light may be flickering, the wick may be nearly consumed, the oil may be running low, but as long as there is any light at all, there is hope for rekindling, for replenishment, for the dawn that follows even the longest night. But this optimistic reading sits uncomfortably with the historical reality. The lamp did eventually go out. The sanctuary at Shiloh was destroyed. The ark was captured and never returned to that place. The line of Eli ended in blood and disgrace. Samuel's calling did not prevent disaster. It only narrated it before it happened. So what kind of a hope is this? Is it simply the hope that truth will be spoken, even if it changes nothing? Is it the hope that someone will bear witness, even in the midst of collapse? Finally, there is something unspoken in this narrative that deserves attention. God bypassed the entire religious hierarchy to speak to a child. He did not go through official channels. He did not honour the established order. He did not consult with the high priest or seek permission from religious authorities. He simply called out in the darkness to a boy who had no status, no authority, no credentials beyond faithfulness in small things. This is either deeply encouraging or deeply unsettling, depending on your perspective. It suggests that divine communication is not controlled by institutions, that truth can emerge from the margins, that the voice of God might speak to those we least expect, rather than to those we have designated as official intermediaries. But it also raises anarchistic questions about authority and order, about how we distinguish genuine divine calling from delusion or manipulation, about what happens when everyone claims to hear the voice of God speaking contradictory messages. Samuel's story is ultimately about availability. He was not the most powerful person in Israel. He was not the most educated or the most connected. He was simply present, attentive, and willing to respond when he heard his name called. And that was enough. That has always been enough. But it invites us to ask, what are we available for? What sacred spaces do we inhabit, whether physical or spiritual or psychological, where we might be found by whatever calls to us in the darkness? And when that call comes, will we recognise it, or will we mistake it for something ordinary, something explainable, something that requires no response? Epilogue: The Voice in the Night. Close your eyes and imagine that sanctuary again. The vast stone building in Shiloh, the oil lamps casting their gentle light, the the shadows dancing on walls that have witnessed generations of worship and neglect. Imagine the boy lying near the ark, exhausted from a day of simple service, drifting into sleep with no expectation that this night will be different from any other. And then the voice, clear, personal, undeniable, a voice that breaks through the silence of heaven and calls a child by name. Samuel's story is a reminder that the divine does not always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes as a whisper in the darkness. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a question repeated until we finally understand that we are being addressed. Sometimes the most significant moments of our lives happen when we are alone, unguarded, simply present in a space where we have made ourselves available to something greater than ourselves. The lamp of God is still burning. That is the promise embedded in this ancient narrative. No matter how dark the times, no matter how corrupt the systems, no matter how silent heaven seems, there is always a light somewhere refusing to go out, and there is always the possibility that in the quiet, in the stillness, in the spaces between our busy thoughts and desperate prayers, we might hear our name spoken by a voice we do not yet recognize. The question is not whether the voice is calling. The question is whether we are listening. Samuel lay in that sanctuary as a boy and became a prophet because he learned to say 5 words that changed everything. Speak, for your servant is listening. He did not demand proof. He did not negotiate terms. He did not insist on understanding everything before committing to anything. He simply made himself available, and availability was enough. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Samuel's calling. Not that he became powerful or influential or historically significant, though he became all those things. The real legacy is that he teaches us what it looks like to be genuinely open to transformation, to be willing to hear hard truths, to be faithful in small things while waiting for larger purposes to reveal themselves. In our age of constant noise and perpetual distraction, where silence is something to be feared rather than cherished, Samuel's story feels almost subversive. It suggests that the most important communications might not come through our devices or our carefully curated information streams. They might come in the quiet, in the dark, in the moments when we stop performing and simply exist in the presence of something that knows our name. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider the possibility that you, too, might be lying in a sacred space, even if you do not recognize it as such. Consider the possibility that there might be a voice, gentle and persistent, calling your name in the darkness. Consider the possibility that the most profound transformation of your life might not begin with a grand revelation or a spectacular sign, but with the simple decision to respond to that voice with 5 words. Speak, for your servant is listening. The lamp is still burning. The voice is still calling. The only question is whether we have ears to hear.
The fire on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Hello everyone, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into today's powerful message, I want to connect with each of you personally. How has your day been treating you so far? Whether you're watching this in the early morning hours as the sun rises, during your lunch break, in the middle of a busy day, or perhaps late at night when the world has quieted down, I want you to know that this moment we're sharing together is sacred. I'm curious about where you're joining us from today. Are you listening from bustling New York City, the peaceful countryside of Iowa, the sunny beaches of California, Or maybe you're tuning in from across the globe, in London, Sydney, or somewhere in between. Wherever you are, whatever time it is in your corner of the world, you are exactly where God wants you to be right now. If this is your first time joining us, I want to extend a warm welcome to our Sacred Rest family. We're so grateful you're here. And if you've been walking this journey with us, thank you for your continued faithfulness and support. Before we begin today's incredible story, I encourage you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber if you haven't already. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss these life-changing messages that God has in store for us. Now let's prepare our hearts for what I believe will be one of the most dramatic, faith-building stories you'll hear. Today we're travelling back over 2,800 years to witness one of the most spectacular demonstrations of God's power ever recorded in human history. We're going to Mount Carmel in ancient Israel, where one man's faith stood against an entire nation's rebellion, where fire fell from heaven, and where hearts were turned back to the one true God. The fire on Mount Carmel, Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Chapter 1. A nation in spiritual freefall. Picture, if you will, the ancient kingdom of Israel during one of its darkest hours. This wasn't just a time of political upheaval or economic hardship, though both of those existed. This was a time of complete spiritual catastrophe, a moment when an entire nation had turned its back on the God who had delivered them from slavery in Egypt, who had parted the Red Sea, who had given them the Promised Land. King Ahab sat on the throne of Israel, and beside him ruled Queen Jezebel, a woman whose very name has become synonymous with wickedness and manipulation. Jezebel wasn't just content to worship false gods herself. She was determined to drag the entire nation of Israel down with her into the depths of idolatry and spiritual darkness. Under their reign, temples to Baal began sprouting up across the landscape like poisonous mushrooms after a storm. Baal was the Canaanite storm god, supposedly the controller of rain and fertility, the giver of crops and abundance. The people were drawn to him because they believed he could provide what they desperately needed: prosperity, security, and success. Sound familiar? In our modern world, we may not bow down to statues of Baal, but how many of us have made idols out of our careers, our bank accounts, our social media followers, or our pursuit of comfort and pleasure? The heart of humanity hasn't changed much in nearly 3,000 years. But Jezebel wasn't satisfied with just building temples. She launched a systematic persecution campaign against the prophets of the Lord. These faithful men and women of God were hunted down like criminals. Some were executed, others were forced to hide in caves and secret places, living in constant fear for their lives. The word of God was being silenced, and darkness was spreading across the land like a plague. Can you imagine living in such a time, when speaking the truth about God could cost you your life, when the very foundations of faith that had sustained a nation for generations were being torn down brick by brick, when it seemed like evil had won and righteousness had fled? Yet in the midst of this spiritual holocaust, God had his man. His name was Elijah, and he was about to become the most famous prophet in Israel's history. Chapter 2. The Drought of Divine Judgment. Before we meet Elijah face to face, we need to understand the backdrop against which his ministry unfolded. For 3 long years, not a single drop of rain had fallen on the land of Israel. This wasn't just an inconvenient dry spell or a minor weather pattern. This was divine judgment, God's response to a nation that had forgotten him and chased after false gods. The drought was devastating in ways that are hard for us to fully comprehend in our modern world of grocery stores and water systems. Rivers that had flowed for centuries dried up to cracked mud. Wells that had sustained families for generations ran completely dry. Crops withered in the fields, livestock died, and famine stalked the land like a relentless predator. People were desperate. Children cried from hunger. Farmers watched helplessly as their fields turned to dust. Merchants had nothing to sell, and families had nothing to eat. The very fabric of society was unravelling under the weight of this supernatural judgment. And yet, in their desperation, most of the people didn't turn back to the Lord. Instead, they cried out even more desperately to Baal, pleading with the storm god to send rain. They increased their sacrifices, intensified their rituals, and multiplied their prayers to deaf idols. They were convinced that if they just tried harder, if they just offered more, if they just believed with greater fervour, Baal would answer and the rains would come. But the skies remained as bronze hard and unyielding. Day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, the sun blazed down mercilessly from a cloudless sky. The drought continued, and Baal remained silent. This is the world into which God sent his prophet Elijah. Not a comfortable world of revival meetings and supportive congregations, but a hostile environment where speaking God's truth could mean death, where the majority had embraced lies, and where the very elements seemed to declare that God's judgment was upon the land. Chapter 3. Enter Elijah, the man of fire. Elijah appears in the biblical narrative like a bolt of lightning splitting the darkness. We don't know much about his background or his early life. He's introduced simply as Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead. No impressive genealogy, no royal connections, no seminary degrees or credentials. Just a man from a small town that most people had probably never heard of. But what Elijah lacked in pedigree, he more than made up for in faith, courage, and an unshakable conviction that the Lord God of Israel was the one true God. While the nation around him bowed to Baal, Elijah stood firm. While others compromised and conformed, Elijah remained faithful. While the majority chose the easy path of popular religion, Elijah chose the narrow way of truth. God had sustained Elijah supernaturally during the 3 years of drought. First, he had sent him to the brook Cherith, where ravens brought him bread and meat every morning and evening, and he drank from the brook. When the brook dried up, God sent him to a widow in Zarephath, where a handful of flour and a little oil miraculously sustained 3 people for over a year. These experiences had built Elijah's faith to an unshakable level. He had seen God's provision in impossible circumstances. He had witnessed miracles that defied natural law. He had learned to trust completely in God's power and faithfulness, even when everything around him suggested that God had forgotten or abandoned his people. Now, as the drought entered its 3rd year, God was ready to use his seasoned servant for the greatest demonstration of divine power Israel had seen since the days of Moses. The time had come for a showdown that would echo through the ages, a confrontation that would prove once and for all who was the true God and who were merely the inventions of human imagination. Chapter 4. The Divine Commission. The word of the Lord came to Elijah with crystal clarity. Go and present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. It was time for the drought to end, but first there would be a reckoning. God wasn't just going to quietly restore the rain and let everyone go back to their lives as if nothing had happened. He was going to make a statement that would be impossible to ignore or explain away. Elijah set out to find King Ahab, but Ahab was already looking for him. The king had been searching throughout his own kingdom and in neighbouring nations, trying to find the prophet he blamed for the drought. When Ahab finally encountered Elijah, his greeting was filled with accusation and anger. Is that you, you troubler of Israel? Can you imagine the audacity? Here was a king who had led his nation into idolatry, who had allowed his wife to murder God's prophets, who had built temples to false gods throughout the land, and he had the nerve to call God's faithful prophet a troublemaker. It's a perfect example of how sin blinds us to our own responsibility and causes us to blame others for the consequences of our own choices. But Elijah didn't back down. With the boldness that comes from knowing you're standing on the side of truth, he fired back. I have not made trouble for Israel, but you and your father's family have. You have abandoned the Lord's commands and have followed the Baals. This wasn't just a theological debate or a polite disagreement about religious preferences. This was a confrontation between the kingdom of God and the kingdom of darkness, between truth and deception, between the power of the Almighty and the impotence of human-made idols. Chapter 5. The challenge issued. Elijah then issued a challenge that would go down in history as one of the most dramatic moments in all of Scripture. Now summon the people from all over Israel to meet me on Mount Carmel, and bring the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Mount Carmel was the perfect location for this showdown. Rising about 1,800 feet above sea level, it offered a commanding view of the surrounding countryside and could accommodate the massive crowd that would gather. More importantly, Mount Carmel was considered sacred to Baal worship. The Canaanites believed it was one of Baal's favourite dwelling places. By choosing this location, Elijah was essentially challenging Baal on his home turf. The terms of the contest were elegantly simple. Get 2 bulls for us. Let Baal's prophets choose one for themselves, and let them cut it into pieces and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. I will prepare the other bull and put it on the wood, but not set fire to it. Then you call on the name of your God, and I will call on the name of the Lord. The God who answers by fire, he is God. It was brilliant in its simplicity. No complicated rituals, no ambiguous signs that could be interpreted different ways, no room for trickery or deception. Fire from heaven would be the ultimate proof. The God who could send fire to consume the sacrifice would be proven to be the true God. The people's response revealed both their spiritual confusion and their deep hunger for truth. What you say is good. They were tired of the uncertainty, tired of not knowing which God to trust, tired of the drought and the suffering. They wanted a clear answer, and Elijah's challenge offered exactly that. Chapter 6. The prophets of Baal take the stage. As dawn broke over Mount Carmel, an incredible scene began to unfold. Hundreds of prophets of Baal gathered around their altar, dressed in their ceremonial robes, carrying their ritual instruments, confident in their God's ability to answer their call. After all, they outnumbered Elijah 450 to 1. They had the backing of the royal court. They had been the religious establishment for years. Surely their God would not fail them now, especially not on his sacred mountain. They began their ritual early in the morning with great enthusiasm and confidence. "Baal, answer us," they cried, their voices echoing across the mountainside. They danced around their altar with wild abandon, their movements becoming more and more frenzied as they worked themselves into a religious fervour. This wasn't a quiet, dignified ceremony. This was raw, primal religion at its most intense. They leaped and shouted, they waved their arms and beat their chests. They called upon their God with every fibre of their being. The sound of their voices, the pounding of their feet, the clashing of their instruments created a cacophony that could be heard for miles around. But as the morning wore on and became noon, something became increasingly obvious. Nobody was answering. The sky remained clear and cloudless. No fire fell from heaven. No voice spoke from the heavens. The altar remained cold and lifeless, despite all their passionate pleading. You have to understand, these weren't insincere men going through empty motions. These prophets genuinely believed in Baal. They had devoted their lives to serving him. They had staked their reputations, their careers, and their very identities on the belief that he was real and powerful. The failure of their God to respond wasn't just embarrassing, it was devastating to everything they had built their lives upon. Chapter 7. Elijah's Divine Sarcasm. As the noon sun blazed overhead and the prophets of Baal continued their increasingly desperate rituals, Elijah decided it was time for some divine commentary. With a wit that was both cutting and brilliant, he began to mock their futile efforts. "Shout louder! Surely he is a god. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or busy, or travelling. Maybe he is sleeping and must be awakened." Can you imagine the scene? Here's Elijah, one man against 450, calmly watching their frantic efforts and offering helpful suggestions for why their God might not be responding. The sarcasm was devastating because it highlighted the absurdity of their situation. If Baal was truly the almighty storm god they claimed he was, why would he need to be awakened? Why would he be too busy or distracted to answer his devoted followers in their hour of greatest need? But Elijah's mockery served a deeper purpose than just humiliating the false prophets. He was exposing the fundamental weakness of all false gods. They are not truly there. They cannot hear because they have no ears. They cannot speak because they have no voice. They cannot act because they have no power. They are creations of human imagination, given form by human hands, but possessing no divine substance. The prophets of Baal, stung by Elijah's taunts and desperate to prove their God's reality, intensified their efforts to an almost unbelievable degree. They began to cut themselves with swords and spears, following their religious traditions until their blood flowed freely. This wasn't just symbolic, this was literal self-mutilation in the name of religious devotion. From noon until evening, they continued this horrific display, their voices growing hoarse from shouting, their bodies weakened by loss of blood, their spirits crushed by the growing realization that their God was not going to answer. The contrast couldn't have been more stark. On one side, frantic activity and desperate self-harm producing nothing. On the other side, one man waiting calmly for his turn, confident in his God's ability to act. Chapter 8. Elijah prepares his altar. As evening approached and the prophets of Baal finally exhausted themselves in defeat, Elijah stepped forward to take his turn. But before he called upon the Lord, he had some important work to do. "Come here to me," he called to all the people. This wasn't going to be a private ceremony or a mystical ritual performed in secret. Everything Elijah was about to do would be in full view of hundreds or perhaps thousands of witnesses. There would be no opportunity for trickery, no possibility of deception, no room for doubt about what actually happened. The first thing Elijah did was repair the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. This altar represented the nation's covenant relationship with God, a relationship that had been broken by years of idolatry and rebellion. By repairing it, Elijah was symbolically calling the nation back to their true identity as God's chosen people. He took 12 stones, one for each of the tribes of Israel, even though the kingdom had been divided for generations. In God's eyes, his people were still one nation, still his chosen ones, still the objects of his covenant love, despite their unfaithfulness. Each stone was a reminder of God's promises to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, promises that remained in effect despite the people's rebellion. With these 12 stones, Elijah built an altar in the name of the Lord. Then he dug a trench around it large enough to hold about 15 litres of water. This wasn't just for dramatic effect, it was about to serve a very important purpose in demonstrating that what was about to happen could only be attributed to divine intervention. Chapter 9. The Ultimate Act of Faith. What Elijah did next was so audacious, so seemingly foolish, that it takes your breath away. Remember, this was in the 3rd year of a devastating drought. Water was more precious than gold. People were dying of thirst. Every drop was carefully conserved and rationed. And Elijah ordered 4 large jars to be filled with water and poured over the offering and the wood. Can you imagine the gasps from the crowd? Can you picture the shock on people's faces as they watched precious, life-giving water being poured out lavishly over an altar? Some in the crowd probably thought Elijah had lost his mind. Others might have been angry at what seemed like a wasteful display. But Elijah wasn't finished. "Do it again," he said. And they did it a second time, pouring out 4 more jars of precious water over the sacrifice and the wood. "Do it a 3rd time," Elijah commanded. And a 3rd time they soaked the altar until the water ran down around it and filled the trench he had dug. 12 jars of water in total. Everything was completely saturated. The wood was soaked through. The sacrifice was drenched. The stones were wet. Even the ground around the altar was muddy with water. If anyone had been planning to suggest that Elijah had somehow hidden fire or used trickery to ignite his altar, that possibility was now completely eliminated. This act of faith was staggering. Elijah was so confident in God's power that he was willing to make the miracle as difficult as possible. He wasn't just asking God to light dry wood. He was asking him to consume a sacrifice that was literally underwater. He was putting his reputation, his ministry, and his very life on the line, betting everything on God's ability to do the impossible. Chapter 10. The Prayer that Shook Heaven and Earth. As evening approached and the time for the evening sacrifice arrived, Elijah stepped up to the altar he had prepared. The moment had come. Everything led to this point. The drought, the confrontation with Ahab, the challenge to the prophets of Baal, the repair of the altar, the soaking with water, all of it was preparation for this moment when one man would call upon the name of the Lord. But notice what Elijah didn't do. He didn't scream and shout like the prophets of Baal. He didn't dance wildly, or cut himself, or work himself into a frenzy. He didn't perform elaborate rituals, or recite complicated incantations. He simply prayed, and his prayer was a model of faith, simplicity, and complete dependence upon God. "Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he began, immediately identifying the God he served not as a local deity or a tribal God, but as the God of the covenant, the God who had made promises to the patriarchs and had been faithful to those promises for generations. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant and have done all these things at your command." This wasn't about Elijah's reputation or glory. This wasn't about proving his own power or wisdom. This was about demonstrating to a watching world that the Lord alone is God, and that Elijah was merely his obedient servant. "Answer me, Lord, answer me, so these people will know that you, Lord, are God, and that you are turning their hearts back again." The purpose of the miracle wasn't to show off, or to defeat enemies, but to turn hearts back to God. This was an act of divine love, a desperate attempt to rescue a nation from the spiritual destruction they had brought upon themselves. The prayer was short, simple, and powerful. No theatrical performance, no manipulation of emotions, no attempt to work up faith through human effort. Just a straightforward request from a faithful servant to his all-powerful God. Chapter 11. Fire falls from heaven. What happened next has never been equalled in human history. The response to Elijah's prayer was immediate, dramatic, and absolutely unmistakable. Fire fell from heaven. Not a small flame that gradually grew, not a spark that ignited the wood, not a natural phenomenon that could be explained by meteorology or chemistry. This was supernatural fire, divine fire, holy fire that blazed down from the throne of God himself. And this fire didn't just consume the sacrifice, it didn't just burn up the wood, it consumed everything. The offering was instantly vaporized. The wood disappeared in a flash. The 12 stones that Elijah had so carefully arranged were completely consumed. Even the soil around the altar was burned up. The water in the trench, all those precious gallons that had been poured out, was licked up by the divine flames as if it had never been there. The heat must have been incredible. The light must have been blinding. The sound must have been like thunder echoing across the mountainside. Everyone watching would have felt the power of God in a way that shook them to their very core. This wasn't just a miracle, it was a demonstration of absolute divine authority. God was making a statement that could not be ignored, denied, or explained away. He was declaring to Israel, to the prophets of Baal, to King Ahab and Queen Jezebel, and to everyone watching, that he alone is God, that he alone has power over the elements, and that he alone deserves worship and obedience. Chapter 12. The people's response. When the people saw the fire fall from heaven and consume everything on the altar, their response was immediate and overwhelming. They fell prostrate on the ground, not just kneeling, but face down in the dirt, overwhelmed by the presence and power of the Almighty God. And they cried out in unison, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" Think about what this meant. Many of these same people had been worshipping Baal just hours before. They had been convinced that the storm god was real and powerful. They had invested their hopes, their prayers, and their sacrifices in a false deity. But now, confronted with undeniable evidence of God's power, they acknowledged the truth they had been running from for 3 years. This wasn't just an intellectual acknowledgement or a polite religious sentiment. This was a deep, heart-level recognition of divine authority. They had seen something that shattered their old beliefs and transformed their understanding of spiritual reality. The God of Israel, the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, the God their fathers had worshipped. He was the true God, and all other gods were mere pretenders. The cry, "The Lord, He is God," became a declaration of faith that echoed across the mountainside and down through the centuries. It was a moment of national awakening, a turning point when an entire people group remembered who they were and whose they were. Chapter 13. Justice and Restoration. But the story didn't end with the people's declaration of faith. God's justice demanded that those who had led the nation astray face the consequences of their deception. Under Elijah's direction, the people seized the 450 prophets of Baal who had spent the day proving the powerlessness of their God. This might seem harsh to our modern sensibilities, but we need to understand the context. These men had been leading an entire nation away from the true God. They had been accomplices in the persecution and murder of God's true prophets. They had been teaching lies in the name of religion, deceiving people who were desperately seeking spiritual truth. Their deception had contributed to the spiritual darkness that had brought God's judgment upon the land. Justice was swift and final. All 450 prophets of Baal were executed, removing the source of false teaching that had poisoned the nation's spiritual life. With the false prophets dealt with and the people's hearts turned back to God, it was time for the next phase of God's plan, the restoration of His blessing upon the land. Chapter 14. The sound of abundant rain. Elijah said to Ahab, "Go, eat and drink, for there is the sound of a heavy rain." This statement is remarkable for several reasons. First, there wasn't a cloud in the sky. The weather conditions were identical to what they had been for 3 years. Hot, dry, and utterly cloudless. But Elijah had the faith to hear the sound of rain that existed only in the promise of God. This is the kind of faith that sees the invisible and hears the inaudible. Elijah wasn't looking at circumstances or relying on weather forecasts. He was trusting in the word of God, who had promised to send rain upon the land. While Ahab went to eat and drink, Elijah climbed to the top of Mount Carmel and threw himself down on the ground in prayer. This wasn't a casual request or a polite religious ritual. This was intense, fervent prayer from a man who understood that he was participating in God's plan to restore his people. 7 times Elijah sent his servant to look toward the sea for signs of rain. 6 times the servant returned with the same report. There is nothing there. But Elijah didn't give up. He didn't doubt God's promise or question his own faith. He kept praying, kept believing, kept expecting God to fulfill his word. On the 7th time, the servant returned with different news. A cloud as small as a man's hand is rising from the sea. To most people, a tiny cloud on the horizon wouldn't seem significant, especially after 3 years of drought. But to the eyes of faith, that small cloud was the beginning of God's abundant provision. Elijah immediately told his servant to run to Ahab with this message: "Hitch up your chariot and go down before the rain stops you." Chapter 15. The Storm of Restoration. What followed was one of the most dramatic weather changes in recorded history. The tiny cloud that had appeared on the horizon quickly grew and multiplied. The sky, which had been clear blue for 3 years, suddenly turned black with storm clouds. The wind began to blow with increasing intensity, and then the rain began to fall. But this wasn't a gentle shower or a light drizzle. This was a torrential downpour, a deluge that made up for 3 years of drought in a matter of hours. The rain came down in sheets so heavy that visibility was reduced to just a few feet. The ground, which had been hard as concrete from years of drought, couldn't absorb the water fast enough, and soon rivers of rainwater were flowing down every hillside and through every valley. It was as if God was saying, "You thought I had forgotten how to send rain? You believed that Baal was the god of storms? Let me show you what real divine power looks like." The storm was so intense that King Ahab, travelling in his royal chariot, had difficulty making the journey back to his palace in Jezreel. But here's one of the most amazing details of the entire story. The power of the Lord came on Elijah, and tucking his cloak into his belt, he ran ahead of Ahab's chariot all the way to Jezreel. Picture this scene. A middle-aged prophet who had just spent an entire day in intense spiritual warfare, who had just called down fire from heaven and orchestrated the execution of 450 false prophets who had just prayed intensely for rain. This same man was given supernatural strength to outrun a horse-drawn chariot for about 17 miles through a driving rainstorm. This wasn't natural human endurance. This was divine empowerment, God's way of putting an exclamation point on the entire day's events. Even in the storm, even in the exhaustion that should have followed such an intense spiritual battle, God's power was sufficient to carry his faithful servant. Chapter 16. Lessons for today. The story of Elijah on Mount Carmel is far more than just an exciting historical account. It's a template for understanding how God works in our world today and how he calls each of us to live lives of faith and courage. First, we see the power of standing alone for truth. Elijah was outnumbered 450 to 1, but he wasn't really alone because God was with him. In our culture today, it often feels like those who stand for biblical truth are vastly outnumbered by those who have embraced the false gods of our age. Materialism, relativism, hedonism, and secular humanism. But numbers don't determine truth, and God's power isn't limited by human statistics. Second, we learn that false gods will always disappoint. The prophets of Baal cried out to their God from morning until evening, but he never answered because he wasn't real. Today's false gods, money, success, pleasure, power, technology, entertainment, promise fulfillment, but can never deliver on their promises. Only the true God can satisfy the deepest longings of the human heart. Third, we see that God often chooses to work through ordinary people who have extraordinary faith. Elijah wasn't from a prominent family or an influential background. He was just a man who believed God and was willing to stake everything on that belief. God is still looking for such people today, men and women who will trust him completely and obey him fully, regardless of the circumstances or the opposition. Fourth, we learn the importance of prayer in the life of faith. Elijah's prayer was simple but powerful because it was offered in complete faith and alignment with God's will. He wasn't trying to manipulate God or impress people. He was simply communicating with his heavenly Father and trusting him to act according to his promises. Fifth, we see that God's miracles often come after periods of preparation and testing. The 3 years of drought weren't just punishment for sin, they were preparation for a miracle. God was setting the stage for a demonstration of his power that would be undeniable and unforgettable. Sometimes what looks like delay in our lives is actually divine preparation for something greater than we could imagine. Conclusion. Where is your Mount Carmel? As we conclude this incredible story, I want to ask you a personal question. Where is your Mount Carmel? What situation in your life is calling for a clear demonstration of God's power and faithfulness? What false gods have you been trusting instead of the one true God? What impossible circumstance are you facing that only divine intervention can resolve? Maybe you're facing a financial crisis that seems hopeless and you need God to provide for your needs in supernatural ways. Perhaps you're dealing with a health challenge that has left doctors puzzled, and you need the great physician to demonstrate his healing power. It could be that you're struggling with a relationship that seems beyond repair, and you need the God of restoration to work a miracle in your marriage or family. Or maybe your Mount Carmel is more internal. Maybe you've been worshipping the false gods of success, approval, comfort, or control, and you need to experience the reality of God's presence and power in a fresh way. Maybe you've been trying to live the Christian life in your own strength, and you need to discover what it means to depend completely on God's power rather than your own abilities. The same God who answered Elijah's prayer with fire from heaven is still on the throne today. He still hears the prayers of his people. He still demonstrates his power in impossible situations. He still turns hearts back to himself and brings restoration where there has been devastation. But like Elijah, we must be willing to stake everything on God's faithfulness. We must be prepared to stand alone if necessary, to trust when circumstances seem impossible, to pray with faith rather than doubt, and to give God the opportunity to show his power in ways that will leave no doubt about his reality and love. The fire that fell on Mount Carmel that day wasn't just about proving that the Lord is God, though it certainly did that. It was about a loving Father reaching out to his wayward children, demonstrating his power not to destroy them but to draw them back to himself. It was about restoration, redemption, and the kind of love that will go to any lengths to rescue those who are precious to him. That same love is reaching out to you today. That same power is available to you in your situation. That same God who answered Elijah is waiting to answer your prayers and demonstrate his faithfulness in your life. The question isn't whether God is able. The question is whether you're willing to trust him completely, to step out in faith even when the odds seem impossible, and to give him the opportunity to show his power in your Mount Carmel moment. So I challenge you today, don't settle for the false gods of our culture. Don't be satisfied with a powerless religion that looks good on the surface but lacks the reality of divine presence. Cry out like the people on Mount Carmel, "The Lord, he is God. The Lord, he is God." And then watch as the fire of his presence transforms your impossible situation into a testimony of his faithfulness and power. The same God who sent fire from heaven is ready to move in your life today. Are you ready to trust him completely and see what he will do? Remember to subscribe to Sacred Rest for more life-changing messages like this one. Until next time, may you know the reality of God's presence and power in every area of your life. God bless you.
Hello dear listener and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know how your day has been. Whether it was filled with joy or challenges, you're exactly where you need to be right now. What time is it where you are in the world? Are you settling down for the evening, or perhaps finding a quiet moment in the middle of your day? Wherever you are listening from, know that you are part of our global community of souls, seeking peace and spiritual connection. If this is your first time joining us, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber. We're here to bring you stories that nourish the spirit and calm the mind. Tonight, we journey to ancient Judah, to a time when God called a young man named Jeremiah to carry a message of both warning and hope. This is a story about divine calling, about being reshaped by loving hands, and about finding purpose even in the midst of struggle. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let us begin. In the 13th year of King Josiah's reign over the kingdom of Judah, when the morning mist still clung to the hills of Anathoth, a young man named Jeremiah sat beneath the shade of an ancient olive tree. The leaves whispered secrets in the gentle breeze, and somewhere in that whisper something stirred within his heart. Something he couldn't yet name, but could feel as surely as the warm earth beneath his feet. Jeremiah was not like the other young men of his village. While they spoke boldly of their plans and dreams, he preferred the quiet company of his thoughts. While they gathered in the marketplace to debate and jest, he found himself drawn to solitary places where he could listen to the deeper rhythms of life. His father, Hilkiah, was a priest, and perhaps that was why Jeremiah felt such a natural pull toward the sacred, toward the spaces where heaven seemed to touch earth. On this particular morning, as the sun climbed higher and cast dancing shadows through the olive branches, Jeremiah felt that familiar stirring grow stronger. It was as if someone were calling his name from a great distance, though he heard no voice with his ears. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a vast ocean, knowing you were meant to step in but uncertain of your ability to swim. Then, as clearly as if someone had spoken directly into his ear, came the words that would change everything. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah's heart raced. He looked around, half expecting to see someone standing nearby, but he was alone with only the olive tree and the endless blue sky as witnesses. The voice came again, gentle yet unmistakable. Jeremiah, I have called you to be my messenger. The young man's immediate response was one of panic. Sovereign Lord, he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. I don't know how to speak. I am too young. Who would listen to me? I am nobody special, just a priest's son from a small village. Surely you have made a mistake. But the presence that surrounded him was filled with such love and certainty that his fears began to quiet. Do not say you are too young, came the gentle correction. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you. In that moment, Jeremiah felt something touch his lips. Not a physical touch, but something deeper, more real than anything he had ever experienced. I have put my words in your mouth, the voice continued. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. As the presence gradually faded, leaving only the normal sounds of morning, birds singing, leaves rustling, the distant lowing of cattle, Jeremiah remained sitting beneath the olive tree, stunned by what had just occurred. His life had been ordinary just moments before, and now he was being called to something extraordinary. The weight of it should have crushed him, but instead he felt a strange peace settling over his spirit. He didn't yet understand what lay ahead, couldn't foresee the years of rejection and persecution that awaited him, or the deep wells of sorrow he would have to draw from. He only knew that the God of his fathers had spoken to him, had chosen him for a purpose that was both terrible and wonderful. And though he trembled at the thought of it, something deep within him whispered back, "Yes, Lord, I will go." Months passed after Jeremiah's calling, and he found himself struggling with the enormity of his task. The messages that came to him were not easy ones. Words of warning about the spiritual condition of Judah, prophecies of coming judgment if the people didn't turn back to their God. How could he, a young man with no credentials or authority, stand before the elders and priests and kings with such heavy words? One morning, as Jeremiah prayed in the quiet of his chamber, seeking guidance for this impossible mission, he heard the familiar voice of the Lord speaking to him once again. "Go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message." Jeremiah had passed by the potter's house countless times in his life, but had never paid it much attention. It was a humble building on the outskirts of the village, marked by the constant sound of the spinning wheel and the earthy smell of wet clay. As he approached that day, however, he felt a sense of anticipation, as if he were about to witness something profound. The potter was an elderly man named Malachi, whose hands bore the calluses and clay stains of decades spent at his craft. His hair was white as wool, and his eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had spent his life creating beauty from formless earth. When Jeremiah arrived, Malachi looked up from his wheel and smiled, as if he'd been expecting him. "Shalom, young prophet," Malachi said, his voice warm with genuine kindness. "Please sit and watch. I have work to do." Jeremiah settled himself on a wooden stool in the corner of the workshop, fascinated despite himself. He had never really watched a potter at work before, had never paid attention to the intricate process of creation that happened in this simple space. The wheel began to turn, and Malachi placed a lump of clay in the centre, his hands moving with practiced precision. At first the clay seemed to resist, wobbling and threatening to collapse, but Malachi's hands were steady and sure, applying just the right amount of pressure, guiding the clay upward into the beginning of what would become a vessel. Jeremiah watched in wonder as the formless lump slowly took shape, a wide base, curving sides, the promise of something beautiful and functional. But then something went wrong. Perhaps there was a stone in the clay, or a dry patch that wouldn't bend. The emerging vessel began to collapse, its sides caving in despite the potter's careful ministrations. Jeremiah expected to see frustration on Malachi's face, perhaps anger at the ruined work. Instead, the old man simply smiled and pressed the clay back into a lump, ready to begin again. "The clay has its own nature," Malachi explained, his hands already starting to reshape the material. "Sometimes it has hard spots, or air bubbles, or impurities that make it difficult to work with. But clay is forgiving. It can always be reformed, reshaped, made into something new." As Jeremiah watched, the potter began again, this time working the clay more thoroughly, removing the impurities that had caused the first attempt to fail. Slowly, patiently, lovingly, a new vessel began to emerge, different from the first but no less beautiful. In fact, this second creation seemed to have a character all its own, shaped by the very challenges that had destroyed its predecessor. It was then that Jeremiah heard the voice of the Lord speaking to him, as clear as if someone were standing beside him. "Can I not do with you, Israel, as this potter does? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand." The words hit Jeremiah like a revelation. He understood now why he had been sent to this place, why he needed to witness this simple yet profound act of creation. The people of Judah were like clay in God's hands, sometimes stubborn, sometimes marred by the impurities of sin and rebellion. But God was not a harsh taskmaster who would discard them when they failed to take shape properly. He was like Malachi, patient and loving, willing to reshape them again and again until they became the vessels he had always intended them to be. "The message I want you to carry," the Lord continued, "is not just one of judgment, but of hope. Yes, I must sometimes tear down what is corrupt and broken, but I tear down in order to build up again, in order to create something better and more beautiful than before." Jeremiah felt tears welling up in his eyes as he watched the potter's hands continue their gentle work. Here was a picture of God's character that he had never fully grasped before. Not the angry judge he had sometimes imagined, but the patient artist who sees potential in every lump of clay, who never gives up on his creation, who can bring beauty from the most unlikely materials. "Thank you," he whispered to Malachi as he prepared to leave. The old potter looked up from his work and smiled. "The clay thanks the potter by yielding to his hands," Malachi replied. "Perhaps that is all any of us can do, yield to the hands that know how to shape us into something beautiful." As Jeremiah walked home through the narrow streets of his village, he felt a new understanding of his calling beginning to take root in his heart. He was not just a bearer of bad news, but a messenger of hope. The God who had called him was not a destroyer but a creator, not a tyrant but a loving craftsman who would never abandon his work. The words came to him then, the message he would carry to the people of Judah. "If at any time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down and destroyed, and if that nation I warned repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict on it the disaster I had planned. And if at another time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be built up and planted, and if it does evil in my sight and does not obey me, then I will reconsider the good I had intended to do for it." It was a message of both warning and promise, of judgment and mercy intertwined. Like the potter's hands, God's discipline was always aimed at restoration, always working toward the creation of something more beautiful than before. Armed with this new understanding, Jeremiah began his prophetic ministry in earnest. But if he had hoped that his message of God's love and patience would be readily received, he was quickly disillusioned. The people of Judah, from the poorest peasant to the most powerful priest, seemed determined to resist the very hands that were trying to reshape them. His first major public appearance came during the reign of King Jehoiakim, Josiah's son, who had turned away from his father's reforms and allowed idolatry to flourish once again throughout the land. Jeremiah stood in the temple courts, his voice carrying across the stone courtyard as he delivered the message God had given him. "This is what the Lord says," he proclaimed, his young voice growing stronger with each word. "Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, 'This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord.' If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place in the land I gave your ancestors for ever and ever." The reaction was immediate and hostile. The priests, who had grown comfortable with their compromises and political alliances, saw Jeremiah's words as a direct threat to their authority. The wealthy merchants and nobles who had prospered by exploiting the poor and forming partnerships with pagan nations heard his call for justice as an attack on their way of life. "Who does this young man think he is?" they muttered among themselves. "He speaks of judgment and destruction like some kind of doomsday prophet. Where is his authority? Where are his credentials?" But Jeremiah continued, his heart breaking even as he spoke the words God had given him. He could see the spiritual adultery that had infected his beloved nation, the way they had turned from the God who had delivered them from Egypt and given them this promised land. They had made alliances with foreign powers, adopted their gods, and forgotten the covenant that had made them a people set apart. "My people have committed two sins," he declared, his voice now thick with emotion. "They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." The imagery was powerful and heartbreaking. Jeremiah could see it so clearly. A nation that had access to the purest, most life-giving water imaginable, yet had chosen instead to dig broken wells that left them thirsty and desperate. They had exchanged their glory for worthless idols, their security for political alliances that would ultimately fail them. As the weeks and months passed, Jeremiah's message remained consistent, but the opposition grew fiercer. He was mocked in the streets, his words dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Children threw stones at him, and adults crossed to the other side of the road to avoid his presence. The loneliness was crushing, but what hurt most was seeing the people he loved rushing toward destruction, their ears closed to the voice of the one who wanted to save them. One particularly dark day, after being physically threatened by a group of priests who wanted to silence him permanently, Jeremiah found himself wondering if he had misunderstood his calling. Perhaps God hadn't really spoken to him at all. Perhaps he was just a deluded young man with an overactive imagination and a tendency toward melancholy. But then he remembered the potter's house, the gentle hands shaping and reshaping the clay, and he understood something profound about the nature of love. True love doesn't just tell people what they want to hear, it tells them what they need to hear, even when that truth is painful. The potter sometimes had to apply pressure to the clay, had to work out the impurities and air bubbles, and this process wasn't always comfortable for the clay, but it was necessary for the clay to become what it was meant to be. "I am not their enemy," Jeremiah whispered to himself as he walked through the quiet streets late one evening. "I am their friend. I am speaking these hard words because I love them, because God loves them, because we can't bear to see them destroy themselves." The revelation gave him strength to continue, even as the opposition intensified. He began to write down his prophecies, creating a record of God's words that could be preserved even if his voice was silenced. He wrote of the coming judgment, but also of the hope that lay beyond it, the promise of a new covenant, a time when God would write his law on their hearts rather than on tablets of stone. "The days are coming," he wrote, his hand moving quickly across the parchment, "when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." Even in the midst of his loneliness and rejection, Jeremiah held on to this vision of hope. The potter was still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the clay of human hearts. The process might be painful, but the end result would be worth it all. There came a time when the weight of his calling became almost too much for Jeremiah to bear. The constant rejection, the threats, the loneliness of being God's messenger to a people who didn't want to hear from God. It all pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had been faithful to his calling for years now, and what did he have to show for it? A nation that seemed more rebellious than ever, leaders who actively opposed him, and a heart that felt like it might break from the strain. The breaking point came when Pashur, the priest who was chief officer in the temple, had Jeremiah beaten and put in stocks overnight for prophesying that Jerusalem would be destroyed. The humiliation was complete, displayed like a common criminal in front of the very people he was trying to save. When he was released the next morning, bruised and aching, Jeremiah's first instinct was to flee. He made his way to his favourite spot of solitude, a small grove of trees outside the city where he often went to pray. There, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of nature, he poured out his heart to God in words that were both complaint and lament. "You deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived," he cried out, his voice raw with emotion. "You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long." The words felt almost blasphemous as they left his lips, but they were honest words, torn from the depths of his soul. He'd given everything to this calling. His youth, his dreams of a normal life, his relationships with family and friends. And for what? To be treated as a pariah, a madman, a troublemaker. In that moment of deepest despair, Jeremiah made a decision that felt like the only sane choice left to him. He would be silent. No more prophecies, no more warnings, no more attempts to turn the hearts of a stubborn people back to their God. He would find a quiet corner of the world and live out his days in peace, letting others worry about the spiritual condition of the nation. The resolve felt good at first, like setting down a burden that had been crushing him. For several days, he said nothing about the visions that continued to come to him, ignored the urgings in his spirit to speak out against the injustices he witnessed. He tried to live like a normal person, to find satisfaction in simple pleasures and everyday concerns. But something strange began to happen. The more he tried to suppress the words God had given him, the more they seemed to burn within him. It was as if a fire had been kindled in his bones, a flame that grew hotter the more he tried to smother it. The visions wouldn't stop coming. The burden for his people wouldn't lift, and the words of God seemed to be blazing inside him like a furnace. But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name, he found himself whispering, his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in. Indeed, I cannot. The realization came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over the mountains. He couldn't stop being a prophet any more than he could stop being human. This wasn't just something he did. It was who he was. God had formed him in the womb for this purpose, had written this calling into the very fabric of his being. To deny it would be to deny himself, to attempt to live as someone he was never meant to be. But more than that, he began to understand that his struggles and sufferings were not signs that he had failed in his calling, but evidence that he was fulfilling it exactly as God intended. The potter sometimes had to apply intense heat to the clay to make it strong and durable. The fire in his bones wasn't a punishment. It was the very thing that qualified him to speak for God. The Lord is with me like a mighty warrior, he declared, his voice growing stronger with each word. So my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. They will fail and be thoroughly disgraced. Their dishonour will never be forgotten. The change in perspective was revolutionary. Instead of seeing his sufferings as evidence of God's abandonment, Jeremiah began to understand them as proof of God's presence. The fire in his bones wasn't consuming him. It was refining him, purifying him, making him into the kind of vessel that could carry God's words to a broken world. He thought again of the potter's house, of the way Malachi had worked the clay with such patience and skill. Sometimes the potter had to put the vessel into the fire to make it strong, to burn away the impurities and set the shape permanently. The heat wasn't cruelty, it was love, the kind of love that was willing to do whatever it took to create something beautiful and lasting. I will speak, Jeremiah said aloud, his voice carrying across the quiet grove. I will speak because I must, because the words are like fire in my bones, because God has made me a prophet to the nations. I will speak not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. I will speak not because people want to hear, but because they need to hear. I will speak because the potter is still at work and I am his instrument. The fire in his bones had become not a burden, but a gift, not a curse, but a blessing. It was the very thing that enabled him to continue when everything else told him to quit, the divine energy that sustained him through rejection and persecution. He was not just a messenger, he was a burning message, a living embodiment of God's passionate love for his people. The years passed, and Jeremiah's prophecies began to unfold with heartbreaking accuracy. The Babylonian army, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, laid siege to Jerusalem just as God had warned through his prophet. The city that had been called the joy of the whole earth was now surrounded by enemy forces, its people trapped within walls that had once seemed impregnable. During the siege, Jeremiah found himself in an impossible position. His prophecies of judgment were being fulfilled before everyone's eyes, but instead of vindicating him, this only increased the hostility toward him. The leaders of Jerusalem accused him of being a traitor, of collaborating with the enemy by undermining morale with his gloomy predictions. "You're deserting to the Babylonians," they shouted when he tried to leave the city on a simple errand. They arrested him, beat him, and threw him into a dungeon where he remained for many days, forgotten and alone. But even in that dark place, the word of the Lord continued to come to him, and strangely it was not a word of judgment, but of hope. "Call to me and I will answer you," came the familiar voice in the darkness. "I will tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know." The message that came to him there in the dungeon was one of the most beautiful and hopeful prophecies he had ever received. It spoke of a time when the city would be rebuilt, when the people would return from exile, when joy and celebration would once again fill the streets of Jerusalem. It was a promise of restoration so complete and wonderful that it seemed almost too good to be true. "I will bring health and healing to it," God promised. "I will heal my people and will let them enjoy abundant peace and security. I will bring Judah and Israel back from captivity, and will rebuild them as they were before. I will cleanse them from all the sin they have committed against me, and will forgive all their sins of rebellion against me. Then this city will bring me renown, joy, praise and honour before all nations on earth that hear of all the good things I do for it." Even as the sounds of warfare grew louder outside his prison walls, Jeremiah held on to these words of hope. The potter was still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the broken clay of human hearts and human history. When the city finally fell, it was as devastating as Jeremiah had predicted. The temple was destroyed, the walls torn down, the leaders killed or carried away into exile. The sight of Jerusalem in ruins was almost more than the prophet could bear. This was the city where God had chosen to dwell, the place where his people had worshipped for centuries. Now it lay in smoking rubble, its streets filled with the debris of a civilization that had forgotten its God. In the aftermath of the destruction, Jeremiah sat among the ruins and wept. The tears came not from a heart that said, "I told you so," but from one that was genuinely broken for the suffering of his people. He had warned them, yes, but he had never wanted to see them destroyed. He had hoped until the very end that they would turn back to God and avoid this terrible fate. It was then that he began to write what would become known as the Book of Lamentations, a collection of funeral songs for a dead city, poems of grief and mourning that captured the full depth of the tragedy that had befallen Jerusalem. But even in the midst of this profound sorrow, hope refused to be extinguished. "Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed," he wrote, his hand trembling as he formed the words, "for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." The words seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his own understanding, as if the Spirit of God was using his human grief to express a divine truth that transcended the immediate circumstances. Yes, Jerusalem had fallen. Yes, the people were scattered and the temple destroyed. But God's love had not failed. His faithfulness had not ended. His compassions were indeed new every morning, even in the darkest of times. "The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him," he continued, "to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." As he wrote these words, Jeremiah began to understand something profound about the nature of hope. It wasn't based on circumstances or on the absence of suffering. True hope was rooted in the character of God himself, in his unchanging love and faithfulness. The potter might allow the clay to be broken, but he would never abandon it. He might permit the vessel to be shattered, but only so that he could create something even more beautiful from the pieces. "For no one is cast off by the Lord forever," he wrote, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone." The ruins of Jerusalem became, in a strange way, a place of worship for Jeremiah. There among the broken stones and scattered debris, he found a closeness to God that he had never experienced before. The external symbols of faith were gone, but faith itself remained. The building had been destroyed, but the builder continued his work. People would come to him there, survivors of the siege who were struggling to make sense of what had happened. They would ask him why God had allowed such suffering, why the innocent had to pay for the sins of the guilty, why the city of God had been given over to pagan armies. "I cannot answer all your questions," Jeremiah would tell them gently, "but I can tell you what I've learned in my years of walking with the Lord. He is like a potter who shapes clay, and sometimes the shaping process is painful. But he never works without purpose, and he never abandons what he has begun. The vessel may be broken, but the potter's hands are still at work creating something new from the pieces. In the final years of his life, Jeremiah found himself in Egypt, carried there against his will by a group of Jewish refugees who feared remaining in the land of Judah. It was not where he had expected to end his days, far from the city he had loved and served for so many years. But even in this foreign land, he continued to speak the words God gave him, continued to comfort and challenge the people who had been scattered by the winds of history. As he sat one evening by the banks of the Nile watching the sunset over the ancient land of the Pharaohs, Jeremiah reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this place. He was no longer the young man who had trembled beneath the olive tree at his first calling. His hair was now white, his hands marked by years of writing and rewriting God's words, his heart scarred by decades of rejection and persecution. But he was not bitter. Somehow, through all the pain and struggle, he had learned to see his life as part of a larger tapestry that God was weaving through history. He was just one thread in that tapestry, but he had been woven in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, for exactly the right purpose. A young Jewish woman approached him as he sat by the water, her eyes reflecting the same uncertainty and pain he had seen in so many faces over the years. "Prophet," she said softly, "my heart is broken. I have lost everything. My home, my family, my future. How can I believe that God still cares about me?" Jeremiah smiled and gestured for her to sit beside him. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his voice warm with the wisdom of long experience. "Once God sent me to a potter's house to watch him work. The potter was shaping a vessel on his wheel, but something went wrong. The clay became marred, misshapen, useless for its intended purpose." The young woman leaned forward, intrigued despite her sorrow. "I expected the potter to throw the clay away," Jeremiah continued. "After all, it was ruined, wasn't it? But instead, he gathered it up and began again. He worked the clay, removed the impurities, and slowly shaped it into something new. The second vessel was different from the first, but it was beautiful in its own way. Perhaps even more beautiful because it bore the marks of the potter's patient love. "But what does this mean for me?" the woman asked. "How does this help me with my broken heart?" Jeremiah reached down and picked up a small piece of clay from the riverbank. "This is what God showed me that day," he said, working the clay gently in his hands. "You are not ruined, you are not beyond hope. You are clay in the potter's hands, and he is still shaping you. The breaking you've experienced is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a new chapter." As he spoke, the clay in his hands began to take shape, becoming a small but perfectly formed vessel. "God's love is like this potter's skill," he continued. "It can take the most broken, damaged clay and create something beautiful from it. Your pain is not wasted. Your tears are not meaningless. They are part of the process by which God is making you into the person he always intended you to be." The woman began to weep, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of hope, of recognition, of a heart that was beginning to heal. "How do you know this?" she whispered. "How can you be so sure?" Jeremiah smiled, and in that smile was the peace of a man who had wrestled with God and found him faithful. "Because I have been clay in the potter's hands for 40 years, he said simply. "I have been broken and reshaped more times than I can count. I have questioned, doubted, even tried to run away from his calling. But through it all, I have learned one thing. The potter never gives up on his clay. He never throws it away. He keeps working, keeps shaping, keeps creating until the vessel is exactly what he envisioned it to be." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jeremiah continued to speak with the young woman and others who had gathered around them. He told them of the promises God had made, of a time when the exiles would return, when the city would be rebuilt, when God would make a new covenant with his people. He reminded them that their current suffering was not the end of the story, but part of a larger narrative of redemption and restoration. "The potter is still at work," he said as the evening drew to a close. In your lives, in the life of our nation, in the great sweep of history itself, He's shaping something beautiful from the clay of human hearts and human history. Trust His hands, yield to His touch, and know that whatever He is creating in you and through you, it will be more wonderful than you can imagine. That night, as Jeremiah lay down to sleep, he thought once more of the potter's house and the lesson that had shaped his entire ministry. He had been privileged to be God's messenger, to speak His words to a generation that desperately needed to hear them. He had endured rejection, persecution, and exile, but he had also experienced the incredible intimacy of walking with God through every trial. His life had not been easy, but it had been meaningful. He had been clay in the potter's hands, shaped and reshaped according to God's perfect will. And though he would not live to see the full fulfillment of the promises he had proclaimed, he knew with absolute certainty that the potter's work would continue. The hands that had shaped him would continue to shape others, generation after generation, until the final masterpiece was complete. The last words he wrote in his journal that night were these: "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in Him." And in the quiet darkness of a foreign land, far from the ruins of Jerusalem but close to the heart of God, Jeremiah slept peacefully, knowing that the potter's hands were still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the clay of human hearts. The message he had carried for 4 decades would outlive him, would speak to countless generations of broken people who needed to know that they were not beyond hope, that the potter never gives up on his clay, and that his love truly is new every morning. The story of Jeremiah reminds us that even in our darkest moments, even when our lives seem shattered beyond repair, we are never beyond the reach of the potter's hands. Like clay on the wheel, we may be broken, but we are never discarded. We are loved, shaped, and reshaped by hands that know exactly what we can become. And in the end, that is enough. That is everything. In the quietness of this story's end, may you find the peace that comes from knowing you too are clay in the potter's hands, being shaped with infinite love and patience into something beautiful beyond your wildest dreams. The potter is still at work, still shaping, still creating, and his love for you is new every morning.